where we end up with is three naturalistic theories that I think are plausible theories, or at least plausibly are theories of robust normativity that stand on their feet despite the objections.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor David Copp. He is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of California, Davis, and his work is focused on moral and political philosophy. His books include, among others, Morality, Normativity, and Society, Morality in a Natural World, and his new book, Ethical Naturalism and the Problem of Normativity, which we'll be focusing on today. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Copp.
Oh, it's good to meet you, Troy. Let me just add an advertisement for. So I did previously did an Oxford handbook, a handbook of ethical theory, which I think some of your listeners might find useful if they want to see sort of an overview of the topics falling under ethical theory. It's a manageable length. It's old, but all the essays are useful. And I'm doing two new handbooks with co-editors: an Oxford handbook of normative ethics and an Oxford handbook of metaethics. Those should be out hopefully in the next year, but things take time, so we'll see. So that's the end of the advertisement.
No, that's great. That's perfectly good. And as I said, at the time of recording, this book that we're going to talk about isn't released yet. I'm pretty sure it comes out in a few weeks, but by the time this is posted, it should be available. So I'll include links to where people can find this on Amazon or elsewhere, whichever bookstores have it.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So just as a sort of introduction to the book, I guess, do you mind giving a bit of an overview of the book? Like what are some of the main themes? What is the intended audience? Maybe what could people expect to learn or gain from the book?
All right. So let's see. Well, it's generally a defense of ethical naturalism, which is the view that there are ethical facts, moral facts, facts about what's rational to believe, facts about what's rational to do. And these facts are natural facts. They're, facts of basically the same kind as meteorological facts or psychological facts or physical facts. And this is a very controversial view even amongst ethical realists. So I'm trying to defend naturalism, assuming ethical realism. I don't really aim to defend ethical realism as such, although there's a lot of discussion of ethical realism, and a lot of what I say can be taken as an argument in favor of ethical realism. But the main thrust of the book is to defend ethical naturalism against the objection that naturalism and other kinds of realism can't really account for the normativity of ethics. So, let's see. Normativity it's not a word in ordinary language, I suppose. So I need to explain what I mean. But the basic idea is that skeptics about ethical realism and also ethical naturalism notice that our ethical beliefs have a bearing on how to act. They're action guiding. They have a kind of practical nature. So you believe you ought to tell the truth. That's supposed to guide you to tell the truth. And the issue is supposed to be that somehow, if you're a realist, so you think there are these facts out there that are ethical facts, you can't really explain successfully the connection between those facts and action. You can't explain the normativity of them. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to, basically to show that that's a mistake, that you can account for it. So I go through like what's meant by normativity, what's meant by realism, what do we mean by a natural fact, what are the alternatives to ethical naturalism. So I run through a whole bunch of alternatives and argue that none of them is really as successful in explaining normativity as ethical naturalism can be. And then I look at varieties of ethical naturalism, different accounts of what the relation is between the ethical facts and natural facts, and different proposals about the exact nature of the natural facts that constitute the ethical facts. And then I deal with a long list of objections to ethical naturalism. So that's the basic overview. And I don't know, should I talk in more detail about any aspects of that, or does that get you the basic idea, you think, Troy?
No, that's great. No, that's good, because we'll get into more of that detail as we go through it.
Good.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I guess this is for anyone who has some interest in metaethics, and especially naturalist proposals or arguments. Naturalism as a theory of in metaethics this is probably a pretty valuable book, I would say.
I could just add that I do talk about expressivism as an alternative and point out some problems with it. I talk about non-naturalism as an alternative, which is where non-naturalism is also a realist view. It also holds that there are moral facts and moral properties, but it claims that these properties are unanalyzable. And one of the main points of the book is that view is not going to successfully explain what normativity consists in. So that's one of the reasons to take naturalism seriously, is that it at least promises to give us an account of what normativity consists in.
Right. Good. Yeah. So sort of on that note, as the sort of subtitle of the book and something you talk about in the first chapter seems to indicate that one of the key issues here is, well, the quote unquote problem of normativity. And as I understand it, an answer or an approach to the quote unquote problem of normativity would involve some analysis of normativity, or an explanation of what makes ethical facts, judgments normative, and like what normativity consists in, and so on. Could you expand a bit more on this issue and why you take it to be sort of key in theorizing about ethics and normativity in general?
Right. Well, I think that I think this, and I try to sort of spell out some detail in the chapter 9, where I go through various objections to ethical naturalism and ethical realism. I think that the normativity of ethical facts and properties lies behind most of the objections to ethical naturalism and ethical realism. So there's I don't know whether I'm getting at exactly what you were asking about, but for example, the expressivists think that there's some kind of a necessary connection between expressing various attitudes of commendation or approval or disapproval and moral judgment. So they point out that if you say, I don't know, torturing babies is wrong, you're expressing disapproval of torturing babies. You're expressing an attitude towards that. And they take that to be central to explaining the normativity of ethical judgment. And they think that really can't be accounted for within a realist position. That's just one example. So there's also another example is the standard objection from which is often called the is-ought problem or the fact value problem. People think that it couldn't be that ethical facts, that there are ethical facts or that there are ethical properties, because you can't derive an ought from an is. The statements about what is the case will never give you logically a conclusion about what ought to be the case. And I think there again that this reluctance to this claim that you can't get an ought from an is seems plausible, because we see that the ought judgments are normative. It's the normativity of the ought judgments that makes it seem impossible to derive an ought from an is. And it can all be boiled down, I think, to the just too different intuition, which David Enoch talks about, and Derek Parfit talks about, although not in those words. The idea that ethical facts are just too different from ordinary, facts about the nature of the world or about what's going on in the world for it to be the case that ethical facts are to be identified with natural facts. And the reason why is I think that the ethical facts are normative. It seems like there's something that's just too different about the normatives that for it to be possible that there's something there's a way of identifying the normative facts with the natural ones. So I think it all in a way, the main objections to ethical naturalism and also the main objections to ethical realism boil down to noticing the normativity of these claims and then drawing the conclusion that these claims couldn't possibly be made true by natural facts or by facts of any kind, really. So if you're a naturalist, this is an objection you have to take seriously. And I think if you're a realist, this is also an objection you have to take seriously, because normativity has been used as a cudgel against both ethical naturalism in particular and ethical realism more generally.
Right. Yeah. But the problem of normativity, I mean, that's something that anyone would face, right? Even if you're a non-naturalist, just that doesn't itself give you an account of what it is to be normative.
No, exactly.
Right? Yeah. So
this is the problem that people have to somehow address, I think, in order to explain the nature of ethical judgment. Because I agree that ethical judgment is normative. That's something characteristic of ethical judgment that is normative. If there are any ethical properties, they would be normative, I think. And so the nature of normativity is something that needs to be explained, I think, by any adequate meta-ethical theory. And, whether realist or not, whether naturalist or not. But it's viewed as a special objection to realism and then also to naturalism. Because, why? Well, I think because many people assume that normativity has to be explained in terms of motivation. And then there's a thought that somehow does not mesh nicely with the realist view that we have ordinary ethical beliefs. Because, I mean, this is all background that's, I don't know how many of your listeners will know this background, how many will not, and I'm sort of skating over a lot of complications here, but there's the idea that ordinary belief is not necessarily connected to motivation unless the believer has an appropriate desire. So the belief that, the sun will rise tomorrow doesn't predict any behavior unless you want to see the sun rise, or unless you have some other desire that this belief is appropriately linked to. It's not going to explain any action on your part. The assumption, though, is that normative beliefs do have a necessary connection to action by themselves. So critics of naturalism and non-naturalism think that there's got to be something in the nature of a normative belief that's desire-like, and they want to argue that that's inimical to the realist picture. So, I don't know. Did that make the connection that you wanted me to make?
Yeah, no, that's good, and we'll get more into that as we go. So in sort of working through it, then in the second chapter, you take some time to try to characterize the target here, normativity, in a theoretically neutral way. So, I mean, this sort of makes sense, right? Because if we're trying to give an account of normativity, it's going to be helpful to have at least some idea of what it is we're trying to capture, or what sort of things would be included and not included. Because I don't know. I think of a lot of things that are normative, or at least associated with normativity, like, rules, duties, obligations, values, reasons, principles, evaluations, responsibility, rights, and so on.
Right.
And, maybe some of those, maybe all of those are normative, maybe some are normatively relevant, maybe some of them are not relevant at all. I mean, how do we go about sort of deciding what gets counted as normative or not, or maybe just normatively relevant?
Well, we have certain intuitions about what claims, what beliefs are normative, and which properties would have to be normative if there were any ethical properties, and so on and so forth. So we use these pre-theoretical beliefs. My goal is to use these pre-theoretical beliefs to try and zero in on the target, the notion of normativity, without at the same time providing a theory of normativity. Because, I think, like you said, you put it nicely, that we need some account of what the target is before we give a theory of that thing that's the target. So, for example, if you want to give an analysis of the nature of, I don't know, knowledge, you need some sense of what the target is. You need some sense of what knowledge is before you can provide a theory of knowledge. And then you need to use that sense of what knowledge is to evaluate the theory, so that if the theory doesn't mesh with your neatly enough with your pre-theoretic conception of what the target is, it's not going to be a very good theory. So what I'm trying to do is something in that early chapter is something analogous to what you might do in trying to give a theory of knowledge and giving a pre-theoretic account of knowledge. I'd want to give a somewhat pre-theoretical account of the nature of normativity so that we can then use that to evaluate theories of what normativity consists in. Right, and so I run through various proposals one might make based on intuitions that we have about the nature of normativity, and try to, zero in on, ways in which these pre-theoretic conceptions don't quite capture the phenomenon we're interested in, ways to develop these pre-theoretic conceptions so that we get a more accurate, extensionally correct picture of the target of our theorizing. And that's, which chapter is that? I guess that's chapter 2, right? So yeah. So for example, games have a kind of normativity. Language has a kind of normativity. So you ought to, in speaking English, there are various formulations of sentences you ought to avoid. You ought to avoid ungrammatical sentences. You ought to speak grammatically, unless somehow by speaking ungrammatically you can make a point of emphasis or something. There are various norms that we try to follow in speaking so as to communicate successfully. And in games, there are various rules that we try to follow so as to play successfully. But I don't think that these rules of grammar or rules of games are normative in the most interesting and important sense, because they don't intrinsically have a bearing on what we ought to do. There's not any failing of a normatively important kind in failing to follow some rule. I mean, suppose, for example, that you're trying to teach a kid how to play chess, right? And you want to motivate this kid by making the kid think that he or she can be successful. So you mess up a little bit. You don't make moves that you ought to make. Maybe you don't cheat. You don't exactly make a move that's ruled out by the rules, but there's certain strategic considerations that you just ignore for the sake of teaching the kid how to take advantage of your strategic mistakes, and so on and so forth. These mistakes are not normatively significant. In fact, in this kind of case, it might be a good thing to make these kinds of strategic mistakes, because from the point of view of what you're trying to achieve, which is a morally important goal of teaching somebody something, teaching somebody a skill, making this mistake and playing the game is a good thing to do, right? So I think that one distinction we need to make in figuring out what the target of our theorization should be is a distinction between purely formal normativity of the kind you find in games and the more robust normativity of the kind you find in ethics, right? So a failure in ethics, like lying to somebody or killing somebody or stealing something, these are failures that are normatively significant in a way that breaking a rule in a game is not in and of itself normatively significant. I mean, it might be if, say, you promise to play fairly, right? But it's not in and of itself normatively significant in the way that an ethical failure is normatively significant. So that's one distinction that I want to draw in that chapter in order to zero in on the kind of robust normativity that we're really interested in.
Right. So that's the distinction between like mere formal normativity and robust normativity. I wonder on that point, what if someone were to say, for formal normativity, it's not really normativity at all, right? It's only robust normativity is real normativity, Well, I mean, is this just a mere terminological dispute, or what do you think about that response?
I think, that's interesting. I mean, my first inclination is to say it's merely terminological, but that wouldn't be completely accurate, because there are some philosophers who think there is only formal normativity. There's no such thing as robust normativity, right? So, I guess you could still accommodate that view within the terminological. I mean, if you take it to be a terminological recommendation to not count for what I'm calling formal normativity as normativity at all, then the philosophers who are skeptical about the existence of robust normativity turn out to be skeptical about the existence of any normativity at all. So, and in a way, maybe they are, because their hope, and I think this is the motivation for their skepticism, their hope is to be able to explain without any kind of metaphysical mystery the nature of the facts that can make an ethical belief be true, and the nature of the ethical beliefs themselves. So if there's no such thing as true normativity, if there isn't any robust normativity, and if we say then, on your terminological recommendation, that there isn't any normativity at all, then the problem of normativity evaporates. We no longer have this difficulty of explaining normativity in a way that makes it compatible with ethical naturalism, because look, I mean, there are certain, it's not metaphysically problematic in any sort of deep way that baseball has certain rules, and that people playing baseball ought to do certain things in order to be playing by the rules. You can look in the rule book, you can look at the behavior of players and referees, and you can, as a sociologist, you can provide a description of the game, the rules, and of people's judgments about what ought to be done. And there's nothing there that's incompatible with a naturalistic worldview. So one strategy for answering this problem of normativity is to diffuse the very idea that there's such a thing as robust normativity. I'm just not attracted to that strategy because I think that there is, I'm tempted to say there is obviously, but let me just say that there is obviously a distinction in normative significance between breaking a moral requirement, like the requirement not to lie, the requirement not to torture people, the requirement, various other requirements, requirement not to steal things from other people that they need, and so on. There's a clear, I think, difference in robustness between failures of this kind and failures to follow a rule in baseball. And that's what I'm trying to capture. That's what I think the normativity objection challenges naturalists to capture.
Right. Good. Yeah. So in the end of this chapter, then you end up characterizing robust normativity as follows. You say, or at least for this purpose of setting the target, for a belief, concept, property, or fact to be robustly normative is for it to have a characteristic, essential, authoritative relation to decisions, choices, intentions, or attitudes. It would have this relation in virtue of its semantics, content, or nature. Okay, so you intend this description to be theory neutral, and so it kind of unavoidably ends up being vague in certain respects. But I worry, like, maybe it's left a little bit too vague in certain respects. So, for example, how are we to understand this authoritative condition? Because I could see people worrying that it's like really unclear what that's supposed to be getting at. I don't know. What do you make of this worry, or could you add something more to that?
Yeah, sure. See, the thing is that there's a well-trodden path here that's taken by the non-naturalists, who argue that normativity can't be analyzed, who argue that the nature of the moral concept, the nature of the moral properties, the nature of normativity itself is unanalyzable. So were I to provide anything that looked like an analysis of this idea of robustness or authoritativeness, I'd already be begging the question against non-naturalists, or at least put it another way, I'd already be raising a flag. I'd already be sort of out there on a limb where non-naturalists would not go along with this characterization of authoritative normativity. So I think it's got to remain vague in order to be theory neutral in the relevant way. I mean, it's not completely vague, because I am talking about an essential connection between normative beliefs, properties, etc., and intentions, actions, choices, and the like. So there's a kind of built-in idea of there being something essential in the nature of these beliefs or properties or attitudes or whatever, and action, judgment, so on and so forth. There's something essential there. That's something, that's a substantive claim about the nature of the normativity we're looking for. But I couldn't really explain the nature of this authoritativeness without running afoul of the non-naturalist position. And furthermore, I don't think I could, I don't know that I can explain this concept of authoritativeness myself. It's because, part of the issue here is, I think, that we need to draw a distinction between the normative concepts and the normative properties. So we have a concept of authoritativeness, right? The non-naturalists say that that concept is unanalyzable. They also think the property of authoritativeness is unanalyzable. But most philosophers, I think nowadays, most naturalists, I think nowadays, would agree that this authoritativeness, that this concept of authoritativeness is unanalyzable. I think it's, and I agree with that. I mean, it's not a comfortable position to be in. It would be nice to be able to give an analysis. It'd be nice to say that the concept of authoritativeness is like the concept of a bachelor. It has a nice, clean analysis that we can lay out there and agree on. But it strikes me as implausible that there could be an adequate analysis of this concept of authoritativeness that the non-naturalists simply haven't noticed, such that they're really, showing themselves to be unacquainted with the concept of authoritativeness, in the way that somebody would be unacquainted with the concept of a bachelor if they couldn't recognize the analysis of a bachelor as an unmarried adult male, right? So it seems to me that the existence of the non-naturalist position is a reason to think that the concept itself is not analyzable. The view about the property is different, though. I think that in fact, I think the property can be analyzed. We can explain the nature of the property, even though the concept that picks it out is unanalyzable. So an analogy here that I use later on in the book is the concept of a living thing, right? So vitalists think that the biological theory of life is mistaken, because it doesn't. I think what it boils down to is that it doesn't mesh with their concept of a living thing. So they don't see how the property of being a living thing could be what the biological theory of life says it is. I think the non-naturalists are in a similar position. They think that the concept of authoritative normativity is such that it couldn't be that the property of it being authoritatively normative is what can be explained in any naturalistic terms. Now, I think it's plausible that the concept of a living thing that we have is not analyzable, even though we do have a biological theory of life that I take to be an adequate theory of life. So suppose you're in the similar position as I am in this book about normativity. You're trying to give a theory of life. You want to point to what you're trying to give a theory of by bringing out the concept of a living thing, but you couldn't give an analysis of that concept because, I'm assuming anyway, the concept of a living thing is not analyzable. You can just get people to see what you're driving at by giving people examples of living things and distinguishing living things from non-living things and saying certain things that are characteristic of living things. like they originate their own motion, and maybe they reproduce, and so on and so forth. That's not going to be an adequate analysis of the concept, probably, but you hope nevertheless to be able to give a theory of what the concept picks out.
Yeah, for sure. No, I definitely agree with that point. Like, I mean, even if it turns out that the concept here is unanalyzable or primitive, that doesn't entail that what, the concept picks out, the phenomena in question itself, is primitive or can't be given a further theory or analysis, reductive or otherwise. So like, yeah, so I think that's, I take that to be the point there, and that seems obviously correct to me. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Now, of course, you might also think that the target phenomenon in question is primitive and can't be given any further analysis. But, that's, whether that's the case isn't derivable from the, this conceptual analysis anyway.
Or that's a further point. Yeah. Further issue. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Sorry if I'm wandering on, if I'm rambling on and on, if you.
No.
If I'm rambling, just say, okay, that's enough. Let's go on to the next question or something.
No, it's perfectly good. I did want to say, sort of as an aside about this point on authoritativeness, I previously talked with Professor Terence Horgan, and he brought up this point about how we tend to have this certain moral phenomenology where we feel a sort of authoritative pull of to do certain things or something like that, where it's just part of the phenomenology that we should do it sort of independently of how we feel about it, or something. If we see somebody being, attacked on the side of the road or something.
Yeah, right.
And I worried. I mean, I sort of understand it, I guess. I mean, in the sense that I have these feelings to do something about that, and it's not. But it's not obvious to me that it's part of the phenomenon. This authoritativeness is part of the phenomenology. I don't, and there I worried that as I sort of do here, that I get. Like, I'm not sure I really get it in the authoritative part of it. And if the concept's unanalyzable, I was like, I don't know. I don't know how to make progress if I don't feel that I have the concept. So I don't know. Maybe you see the
right. There. So the point about the phenomenology. Well, look, I mean, the first thing I guess I should say is that there's no guarantee that every person has the concept in question here, right? So there could be some people. I probably know some people who there's some people probably in the news these days who know full well that certain things are wrong, but they don't have the phenomenology that Terry Horgan was talking about. They don't feel the pull I don't know what the phenomenology would be for that in that case, not the attraction, the repulsion. They don't feel a repulsion in the phenomenology the way that Terry Horgan talks about, and maybe they don't. Maybe they think of morality as just a game like baseball, so they see that just as they see that in baseball the pitcher is not supposed to doctor the baseball, so in ethics you're not supposed to torture babies, and they think of those as just two games. It's sometimes said that psychopaths are in that position, that they can sort of recognize what's wrong and have beliefs about what's right and wrong, but they don't have the phenomenology, and they don't have this concept of authoritativeness. I mean, this is all debatable, right? Some people think that, oh no, they can't really have moral beliefs, they just parrot the words or something. So this is all controversial, but in any event, I think, to be honest, I'm partly writing this book for myself, right? So I think there is this authoritativeness. I think that an adequate account of ethics has to account for the authoritativeness. In a way, I don't really care whether anybody agrees with me, because I want to make the picture that I have of the nature of morality cohere with the kind of naturalistic picture that I want to develop. I think that most other people of good faith who aren't psychopaths, right, do have this view that share with me, this view that there's some significant difference and significance as between breaking a rule in baseball or hockey or whatever sport you're interested in, or in some silly little game like pickup sticks, between breaking a rule in one of these games and breaking a normative requirement, violating a normative requirement, there's some significant difference there. And that's the difference in robustness that I'm talking about. And, people who don't see that difference, well, what can I say? In the limit, I just say, okay, I'm developing this book for myself. But I don't really think so. I think this is a widely shared conception, and I think Terry Horgan has this conception also, although he's an expressivist, unlike me. I think that this aspect of the phenomenology that he's pointing to is a shadow of the authoritativeness that I'm talking about. So I think he's got this concept of authoritativeness also.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so some good things there, and we can maybe come back to some of this stuff, but probably a good point to move on to the third chapter, where you go about sort of categorizing different theories of normativity. And you sort of mentioned this already, but one you start with is normative formalism, which is sort of the reverse of what I was talking about earlier, right? Which says that all normativity is formal normativity. Right. And yeah, I wrote, it's funny because the note I wrote down is sort of something you already said, but maybe some people think this is sort of normative game, right? So to speak, in which we might decide to take part, and there's nothing apart from that game that sort of binds us to act or not act in certain ways, and so on. Right. And you ultimately don't find this plausible, but like, what are some of the issues you see with this sort of approach?
Well, the fundamental issue is what I've already said, is that I think be pretty difficult to deny that there's a significant difference between violating a rule in a game and doing something that's morally prohibited. There's a difference, not just in, it's a different game, but there's a difference in normative significance. There's some something that I want to call authoritative there, something robustly normative there. That's, I think, is the fundamental point. But I should note that there's controversy here. I mean, I think that epistemic considerations are also robustly normative. I think that you have a robustly normative reason to believe on the basis of evidence, not to believe simply on the basis of suspicion. That you have a robustly normative requirement not to go along with the latest conspiracy theory, but to look into the facts behind what people are saying and to try to think for yourself and to think critically. I think these are robustly normative epistemic requirements. But there is, I have to acknowledge, a movement, or I can call it a movement anyway. I don't know whether it's a movement, but there's a bunch of people who seem to want to deny that, who want to say that epistemic normativity is merely formal. But to me, that's well, I think it's profoundly unphilosophical, to be honest, because I think I shouldn't say that, because these are good philosophers who are, have reasons for their view, and one needs to look at their reasons and take them seriously before drawing the conclusion I want to draw. But intuitively, I want to say this is not philosophically solid, because we all think as philosophers that we are obligated to look for reasons for our beliefs. And that's not simply to play a game. That's a deep, normatively significant requirement of intellectual honesty that drives our profession and that should drive everybody's thinking, I think. And that's something that we, insofar as we're proselytizers, we ought to proselytize over this. And, so I think similarly in the moral case, well, I can't say in the moral case that it's unphilosophical because of a different issue. But to me, it's not. The view is so unattractive that I can't really go further in pursuing it beyond noting its unattractiveness. The idea that torturing a baby for fun is of a piece with, moving your bishop the way a knight should move, or something like that. It seems to me to be just a completely mistaken viewpoint. So I think normative formalism can be taken off the board for that reason. A good friend of mine is a normative formalist, so I shouldn't disparage it, but that's where I end up. This formalism is attractive to naturalists because if you're an ethical naturalist, as I said before, one way to avoid the challenge of normativity is to make it out to be a completely natural phenomenon, and normative formalism makes it out to be a completely natural phenomenon. It's just a matter of there being certain rules that we accept as a matter of sociology, and we either go along with them or we don't. Normative conceptualism, which is the next view I talk about, is also attractive to naturalists and also to non-naturalists because it locates normativity in our concepts rather than in the world, and so it seems much less mysterious. So it's not, it avoids the normativity problem and the challenge of explaining normativity because it says, well, it explains normativity by saying, look, it's just a matter of the concepts you have. This doesn't mean that there's anything in the world that corresponds to the normativity that's in your concept. Your concept refers to a property, but that property itself isn't robustly normative. The robust normativity lies completely in your concepts. So this normative conceptualism removes the metaphysical worry that you might have had about robust normativity, since it locates robust normativity in our concepts, and it's widely agreed that the normativity in our concepts is not analyzable. So it seems like this would be another way to answer the challenge of normativity.
Right. I did want to bring something up as sort of an aside, although you don't spend a lot of time here in this book, as you said, arguing for realism. But I did previously talk with Lance Bush, who he's done a bunch of work in the sort of psychology of metaethics, and one thing, and a bunch of empirical work there. And one thing that he argues for is that, well, at least folk metaethics is not obviously realist in the way that many people think it to be. Rather, he thinks it's highly variable, maybe sometimes more realist, sometimes more anti-realist, and often even indeterminate as to how it should be categorized in that way. I don't know. I don't necessarily want you to comment on the findings there, but I don't know. What do you think about the relevance of the empirical research into, well, like how our folk ethical concepts and normative concepts work? Is that important to some of this theorizing, or do you think that we can mostly ignore that, or what do you think?
No, good question. Well, I suppose the hard-nosed response would be to say, hey, suppose we did an investigation of the folks' conception of a living thing. Well, you'd find some people believe that to be alive is to be, to have received the magic, certification from God, that brings ordinary matter to life. Some people would be vitalists, that they would think there's something, essentially, intrinsically different about living things that marks them off from unliving things that's not possible to explain biologically. Very few people would, I think, as a matter of their ordinary intuitions, say, well, to be alive is simply to have a kind of, biological engine, going, clicking along in your organism or something, right? So I don't think that. So what we're doing in metaethics isn't a science in the way that biologists are scientists. So what I'm saying is no better than a kind of metaphor, but I think that variation in the ordinary person's conception of what it is for a thing to be living shouldn't cut any ice when it comes to assessing the plausibility of the biochemical theory of living things. And similarly, I want to say, this would be like the hard-nosed initial reaction. Similarly, I want to say variability in ordinary folks' metaethical views shouldn't cut any ice when it comes to trying to come up with a theory of what normativity actually consists in. But that's too quick. I mean, I don't really want to insist on that because I think that a more nuanced way to take account of what you're pointing to is that, well, I confess I haven't looked at the studies, but my hunch, given what you've said, is that it would turn out that although people have ordinary garden variety views about what they should do, it's much less common for people to have metaethical views as a matter of their ordinary intuition. So when you ask them a question about metaethics, like, what is it in virtue of which, it's true that it's wrong to torture cats, right? I would think they would tend, first of all, to give a standard answer from within normative ethics. It's wrong to torture cats because it causes them pain, right? Then if you try to press them on the ethical issues, people, I think, would grasp at things and not really have thought out what their view is. So I think it's a bit much to say that they have ordinary intuitions about metaethics. It'd be like, what would be an example? This is again no better than a metaphor, but if you ask somebody what time it is, they'll have no trouble telling you what time it is, right? And if you ask them whether it's daylight time or standard time, they probably wouldn't have much trouble telling you whether it's daylight time or standard time, right? If they're at all informed about how the clocks work, right? But if you ask them what time consists in, they wouldn't know what to make of this question, I don't think, mostly. They might then come up with some answer that you could then say, well, that's their meta theory, their metaphysics of time. But I don't think that ordinary folks have thought out the issues about the metaphysics of a time in a way that we should take especially seriously in thinking about the metaphysics of time ourselves. So maybe you see the analog. I don't think,
Yeah. I mean, there's a few different ways that the empirical research is done. I don't want to get too much into this because it's sort of a side issue, but yeah, some of it is trying to gauge their metaethical beliefs directly. Maybe it'll explain some relevant notion, like what it means to be objective, and so on, and then ask them, well, what do you think that this sort of ethical claim is like this or not? But sometimes it's just asking direct, like normative questions, or for different scenarios, and you say, and this person disagrees, like, and then trying to gauge sort of indirectly what their metaethical commitments are, or what would be the appropriate metaethical account of their commitments, of maybe a better way to phrase it. But
right.
But although they would say that this sort of research, empirical research, is pretty new and limited. But anyway, This is some of the things that it seems like have been found. I find it interesting anyway.
No, I agree. It is interesting. I think one of, like as you were suggesting there, one of the ways to bring out differences in people's views is to ask them about moral disagreement, right? So A thinks this, B thinks that. What do you think? Which is right? Or are they both right? Or what? And so forth. And some people, people have background views that are going to inform what they say in that case. So I think myself that one of the most common metaethical views that people have is the idea that ethical requirements are based in God's commands. Now, if you think that ethical requirements are based in God's commands, then of course you're committed to the existence of God if you think there are any ethical requirements, and that's a metaphysical commitment. But I guess the more relevant is that if you believe that ethical requirements are based on God's command, and you see a case of ethical disagreement, like as to whether, for example, abortion is morally prohibited or morally allowed, you're going to say, well, you're probably going to say abortion is morally prohibited, and the guy who thinks that is correct. But if you think God is more liberal, you might say, well, God would allow abortion in this case, so abortion in this case is permitted. But you're going to think that one of the two sides of the debate of the dispute is correct, and the other side is incorrect. On the other hand, some people are more committed to a kind of openness about moral disagreement, and would say that it's perfectly, that different strokes for different folks or something. So depending on, I think it is true that depending on people's background views about what's important in life, the nature of life, whether there's a God, and so on, including people's different political views, you're going to get different ways to talk about moral disagreement. So I think that's true.
Yeah,
that's very true.
Yeah. Also, something you said earlier reminded me something that when I talked with Professor Michael Huemer, I think he said something along those lines, which is that like, oh, even if we found out that like folk ethical talk or normative talk more generally is variable or confused or something like that, it's like, okay, but like we still have these in philosophy, normative and ethical notions that we can explore, and even if it's not often or always what the folk are getting at when they employ similar terms. So I don't know, maybe that's something similar to what you were saying at the beginning there, but that makes sense.
I think it is. And, as I said before, my fallback position is that I'm just worrying about my own views and trying to make them coherent. So, but I don't really think so. I think there's a more broad, relevance to what I'm doing. I hope so.
Rare, yeah. So anyway, further on in chapter 3, you also talk about what you call normative conceptualism. I think you've already brought this up a little bit, but I understand it to be the view that normativity is fundamentally a feature of our concepts rather than of the properties or facts that those concepts might represent. It's the concepts that are really normative, whereas the worldly properties or states of affairs are not normative or maybe derivatively normative. So, I mean, I don't know. Could you talk a bit more about this sort of theory and why you ultimately don't think it works?
Right. Okay. Well, let's see. I do towards the end of that section of the chapter propose an argument which I think shows that this view is incoherent. I won't try to rehearse that here because I think, in a way, well, if you want to, we can, but I think in a way that's getting further into the weeds than we need to in this discussion, because the fundamental point is, I think, the intuitive point that that when somebody does something that we think of as wrong, like torturing a baby or torturing a cat or lying in a way that causes somebody a serious loss or serious harm, etc. When somebody does something that's wrong, we don't think that this is merely a matter of how we think about things. We're not thinking, oh, I just happen to think that this is, you do just happen to think it's wrong. I mean, it is the case that you, as a matter of empirical fact, think the thing in question is wrong. So you could say, well, this is just how I think of things. It would be true that this is how you think of things. But what you're thinking and thinking of things that way is not just that, oh, this is an optional way to think. I might have thought in a different way, or I might have thought, other people will think. You're thinking that there's something about the action that this person is doing. There's something about that action as it is that it has this characteristic property of being wrong. You're not, right? So, maybe I'm making too much of this and trying to not, but my thought, and I think your thought, and I think most of the listeners' thoughts, and when they think of something that's wrong, is not that this thought is just referring back to the concept that the thought is formulated in terms of. It's not just a thought about the thought. It's a thought about the reality, the action that's actually occurred, and is ascribing to that action some characteristic, as opposed to simply assigning, categorizing that action under a concept. It's doing that, but it purports to do more than that. We think of ourselves as doing something fundamentally different from that. That, I think, is that's my attempt anyways to capture the intuitive reason why normative conceptualism, I think, is problematic.
Yeah. Good. I wonder how you would categorize the following sort of view. Suppose we are a sort of analytic naturalist, and we think that what it just what it means to be good, for example, is to like promote well-being or something like that. We could fill in more details, but I suppose that's all it amounted to. Could that be? Would that be a sort of like how would that count as a kind of conceptualist view or not? I mean, or could it count as a objectionalist view?
Okay, so right, so the view is the view that we have this concept of you're sort of describing a kind of utilitarianism or consequentialism, right?
Sure, it might fall into those categories.
Maybe I lost concentration there for a moment, but I think you're describing a kind of consequentialism, right? And I think you're
sure.
Yeah. So let's take the view that for an action to be wrong is for it to fail to maximize the expected well-being or something. I think that was the kind of view you had in mind, right? So
and importantly, that falls out of the meaning of what wrong, like of the term wrong, right? It's not just something we could discover about like a criterion of wrongness. It's just that's all it means, say, perhaps.
Right. So I mean, here's a distinction that maybe we should draw here as a background to what we're talking about. There is a view, there is a kind of utilitarian view which says that the wrong actions are those that fail to maximize the general happiness or something like that, where the claim isn't that that the property of wrongness itself is the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. The view of the ordinary consequentialist is that actions have this property of being wrong because or in virtue of having the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. That's the ordinary consequentialist way of thinking. But we're trying to zero in on a slightly different view, which holds that wrongness itself just is the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. So on this view, when you say that wrong actions are actions that fail to maximize the general happiness, you're not, as it were, invoking two properties, the property of failing to maximize the general happiness and the property of wrongness. They're just the one property, right? So I think that second view is the view you were asking about, right? Is that right? So in a sense, as you put it, the meaning of the term wrong is fails to maximize the general happiness. So there's just the one thing, failing to maximize the general happiness, of which we have sort of two ways of thinking. We can think of it as wrong, or we can think of it as failing to maximize the general happiness, right? So the conceptualist, so the normative conceptualist wants to say, let's see if I can get this straight. The normative conceptualist wants to say that the normativity involved is simply a feature of the concept wrongness. There's just this normative way of thinking of the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. And then there's the naturalistic way of thinking about that property, which is to think of it as the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. There's nothing normative about the property itself. It's just that we have a normative way of thinking of the property, right? That's the I think I've got it right. That's the normative conceptualist's view, at least as applied to this particular example, right? So there could be an objectionalist version of this, but I don't think it would be very plausible. It would be to say that the normativity in question is not simply a normativity in the concept, but it's also a normativity in the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. There's something normative about the property of failing to maximize general happiness as it is in itself. Something about that as it is in itself is objectively normative. That to me is problematic. And I think the problematic nature of that illustrates why many philosophers think that ethical naturalism is problematic, right? Because if you think that a naturalist view will have to take some property like failing to maximize general happiness as identical to, say, wrongness, and if you think that, an adequate theory is going to have to explain the normativity of the property of the normative properties of the ethical properties themselves, then you're likely to think that ethical naturalism is a non-starter, because the properties that ethical naturalism is going to identify as the normative ones will be just like the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. And there's nothing normative in and of themselves about those properties. Those are the properties, we could say, in virtue of which we take actions to be wrong, just as we take actions to be wrong when they cause people harm, or when they cause people unhappiness, or so on and so forth. Those actions give us reason to object to the actions, but those properties aren't themselves the wrongness, right? Maybe I'm getting off topic here. I don't know whether this is the issue you were trying to raise or not, but so bring me back to where you were meaning to direct me.
No, I think that's good. I mean, I was just, as you were explaining that, another potential issue came up for this. If we were to try to make this sort of analytic naturalist view objectionalist, which is that, well, it seems weird to think that if it's a matter of the meaning that such and such actions count as morally good or wrong, and we could have meant other things by the terms, but all the same, it's an objective fact of the property itself that it has these normative features, sort of independent of how we decide to use these terms or something like that. It's something
very puzzling, right?
Something puzzling about that. In other words, it seems weird to think that, I don't know, the objective sort of facts about these normative properties happens to line up with the facts about the meanings that we employ, right, when the account doesn't seem to give a reason to think that they would. Maybe that's the worry that I'm getting at.
Well, I can say a bit more about this that might help to clarify things. So in the book, I forget exactly where, in one of the chapters, I distinguish this notion of normative grounding from the notion of metaphysical grounding.
Right.
So we do think that whenever an action has a normative property, like the property of being wrong, there's some natural fact about that action that explains why the action is wrong. There's some normative grounding of that wrongness, or as any other moral property. There's some natural grounding of that, some normative grounding of that property, some reason why, something in virtue of which that action, or that whatever it is, has the property in question. Now, I've been talking about actions, but we could be talking about traits of character and virtues or whatever, but let's just focus on actions. Now, in arguing against ethical naturalism, one of Derek Parfit's lines of thought is that the ethical naturalist will end up invariably identifying the normative properties with the properties that ground the property in this normative way. So for example, if you're a utilitarian and you want to be a naturalist, you'll identify wrongness with the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. But properly speaking, failing to maximize the general happiness isn't what wrongness is. It's what grounds the wrongness, what explains why actions are wrong. I mean, not for the rest of us who aren't utilitarians, but if you assume utilitarianism, this would be the way you'd be thinking. It would be that the failing to maximize the general happiness is what makes actions wrong. And then Parfit says quite reasonably, in the case of these kinds of judgments of normative grounding, you've got two properties in question. You've got the property that grounds the wrongness. You've got the property that grounds the wrongness and the wrongness. These are two properties, not one and the same. So if you thought that naturalism invariably would end up identifying the normative ground with the property that it grounds, you're going to think that naturalism is just based on this mistake of ignoring the difference between the grounding property and the property that's grounded in this normative sense. And so in light of this objection that Parfit raises, you can see why normative conceptualism might be attractive, because the normative conceptualist says, oh, wait a minute, we're not saying that the wrongness, the property wrongness, is the same as the property of sorry, we're not saying that the property wrongness is the same as the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. What we're saying is that we have this normative concept wrongness, which picks out the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. So we have this normative property, but the property it picks out is not normative. So we avoid Parfit's objection that the grounding property is not the same as the normative property it grounds, partly because the grounding property is not itself normative. We accept that the grounding property is not itself normative, but deny that there's any normative property at all in the vicinity by saying that the normativity is entirely found in our normative concept, which is just a normative way of thinking of these natural properties that are the grounds of in this case, the wrongness in question. So I don't know what I may have gone too far into the weeds there, but there's one further thing I should say, which might be it's another step into the weeds, but it might be worth taking this step. You wanted to say that, okay, according to the conceptualist, the meaning of the term wrong, or the content of the concept wrongness, is failing to maximize the general happiness. In the case where we're imagining the normative conceptualist is a utilitarian or a consequentialist, right? But I think the better way to think of it is to think of it in terms of reference, not meaning, right? So, okay, so this, how can I explain this? Well, the simple way to explain it is that if you think of the concept of bachelor, the content of that concept is something like unmarried adult male, right? The referent of that concept is the set of all males that it refers to, right? It happens that the males that it refers to are unmarried adult males, but in any case, that's the idea of the distinction. So in the case of this, distinction can be useful to bring out if you're a normative conceptualist, because I think if you're a normative conceptualist, what you're going to want to say is that in the case of wrongness, say, assuming again consequentialism, what you're going to want to say is that the concept wrongness itself is unanalyzable. That is, we can't give its meaning in any informative way. You know, we can say it's the concept of an action's being ruled out morally or something like that, but we can't give its meaning in a way that doesn't essentially involve normative concepts. But we can say what its referent is. It refers to the property of failing to maximize the general happiness. Right? So the property picks out that property of failing to the concept picks out that property of failing to maximize the general happiness. But that property itself isn't normative, even though the concept is normative. And that's the conceptualist position. And before I was trying to explain what my intuitive objection is. My intuitive objection is that when we say an action is wrong, we mean to say, I think, that there's something about that action in virtue of which, we mean to say more than just there's something about that action in virtue of which it falls under the concept wrongness. We mean to say that there's something about it that's itself intrinsically normative. That it's not that we simply happen to think about this action in a certain way that's optional, that we could have thought about it in another way. It's that there's something about that action as it is that if we're going to represent that action fully accurately, we have to be thinking of it as wrong because it's got that wrongness as it is in itself. That's, I think, the intuitive objection I'm trying to capture in my discussion of conceptualism. So I try to bring it out with this argument that the theory conceptualism is incoherent, and that argument's an attempt to make this intuition more precise, but I think at bottom there's just this intuition that I'm relying on.
Right. Yeah. So it's not just like we have these labels and we've decided to count certain sorts of actions and character traits and so on under one like normative label or another as a matter of like semantic whim. Rather, there's some fact about those sorts of actions or traits and so on. It's sort of intrinsic to them in virtue of which they're correctly be counted under one normative category or another.
Right.
That goes against the conceptualist view.
I think so. Yeah, exactly.
And that so you sort of find quite intuitive as well.
Right.
And good. As well, although we're not going to get into it, you said you have given a sort of an argument against the coherence of the view. So then the end of this, the third chapter here, you come to sort of like 4 desiderata that you think are key to a plausible normative theory. So first, it must involve robust normativity, and it must involve objectualism. I don't know if we stated that explicitly here, but as I understood it, objectualism is really like the denial of the conceptualist view. It affirms that there are ethical properties which are intrinsically normative, not non-normative or derivatively normative, rather than just and so that's the first 2. And then the second 2, or the latter 2, were that a reductive analysis of the property, it has to provide a reductive analysis of the property of being normative as such. Or sorry, that was the last one. It has to provide a reductive analysis of ethical properties that shows them to be normative as a matter of their essence. And as I just said, it has to provide a reductive analysis of the property of being normative as such. So yeah, I guess now we've talked a bit already about the first 2 desiderata. I mean, we don't have to get too much into the details, but maybe talk a bit about the last 2 there and why they're important, do you think?
Right. Well, the last 2 are I think, important because, if you think the problem of normativity is a real problem, if you think there is really an objection to ethical naturalism along the line that needs to be answered along the lines that it can't account for normativity, then your theory is going to have to say what normativity consists in. Remember, this is a list of desiderata. I mean, a theory might fail to meet all these desiderata. I mean, maybe it's impossible to meet all these desiderata. A non-naturalist probably would say so. A non-naturalist, I think, has the objectualist view, typically, that there are these properties that are intrinsically robustly normative, but denies that the robust normativity that there is can be given a reductive analysis. But I think that if you're going to really deal with the philosophical puzzlement about what robust normative properties could be like, you've got to say what robust normativity consists in. You can't just, say, well, it's a non-natural property and it's unanalyzable and so on. That doesn't really tell us what robust normativity consists in. So, on that view, you can point in the direction of robust normativity, but you can't say what robust normativity consists in. You can't give an analysis of it. So I think it would be desirable, and that's what I'm saying when I say it's a desideratum. It would be desirable to be in a position to say what robust normativity consists in, and what that would amount to, I think, I'm claiming, is a metaphysical analysis of the intrinsic nature of robust normativity. So, metaphysical analysis, not a conceptual analysis, because we're saying because the view is that the property itself, that these ethical properties are robust in and of themselves. We have these normative concepts, but the properties themselves are robust. So it's even if the concepts of robust normativity is unanalyzable, we need to be able to say what the property of robust normativity consists in. So we're talking about a metaphysical issue, and so the analysis, if there is one, would have to be metaphysical. Now, and a metaphysical analysis would have to say, what essentially robust normativity consists in, because it wouldn't be enough to point to this property of robust normativity and say, what accidental properties it has. Robust normativity is the thing we're thinking about. You might say, here's a property that robust normativity has, but not essential to it. It's the property we're thinking about and talking about in this podcast, right? That's not to say that isn't to get to what the nature of the property is. To get to what the nature of the property is, you have to get to what its intrinsic nature is, I think, what it is essentially. And that's going to be to give an analysis analogous to the analysis of an acid as, a proton donor, which isn't a conceptual analysis. It's a metaphysical analysis, or a scientific analysis, if you like. The analysis of life as this kind of, I can't give the analysis, but presumably there is an analysis that one could give that of living things, such that living things, what they are intrinsically, is that they're things with a certain biochemical nature. What it is, I can't say, but that would be another example of a metaphysical analysis in my sense, because it would be grounded in science, but it would be an analysis of the nature of this property that we take to exist, the property of being a living thing. So in that sense, it's metaphysical. And that's what we'd be looking for to solve this problem to answer this challenge of normativity. That's why I make it a desideratum of a successful theory.
Yeah, right. It makes sense. Yeah. So again, it's really sort of needed to really answer the question or to address the problem of normativity. Right. All right. So then I'll move on to the fourth chapter there, where he takes some more time to characterize ethical realism and contrast it with some alternatives. And one of the key features of realism, as you discuss, is the so-called parity thesis. And so I take the main idea of this is that ethical facts and properties, judgments, and truths have the same basic metaphysical status as facts, properties, judgments, and truths in other fields, such as physical, psychological, mathematical, logical, and so on. So in other words, they are facts. Ethical facts are facts, properties, judgments, truths, and so on, in the same way that facts are, and properties, judgments, and so on are in those other domains, even if they might differ somewhat or significantly in other ways. I think, is that a fair characterization there? I mean,
exactly. The motivation for describing realism this way is to avoid tying moral realism to controversial doctrines about the nature of properties or the nature of truth or what have you. So it's to leave it open. If you think that I suppose it's not left open. Some things aren't left open. Like it's not left open that a property is just a set of things, or it's not left open that a property is really just a concept. But amongst the different metaphysical views there are of the nature of properties, this is meant to be ecumenical. Amongst the different theories there are of the nature of truth, this is meant to be ecumenical. So we don't want to bog down our account of what moral realism is by hanging on to all the baggage from other debates about the nature of realism, right? So that's why I put it that these properties, facts, beliefs, judgments, so on and so forth, are on a par metaphysically with properties, facts, beliefs, judgments, so on, of other kinds.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to think about it, because, as you say, you don't want to. I mean, although you might take a stand on some of those other metaphysical, substantive issues there, you don't have to take a stand on that in order to be a realist in the sense that you're describing. So,
right. I think so. Yeah. So, I mean, most of my discussion I conduct as if we believe there are robust properties that are kinds of similar, objective similarities amongst things, or ground objective similarities amongst things. I talk as though there's truth as a robust property, rather than simply, I talk as if the deflationary theory of truth or deflationary or disquotational theories of truth are set aside and adopt a robust theory of truth. But this is for this convenience of discussion. I don't mean this to be something that realism as such is tied to. And whenever I think there's an important, whenever I think that one of these other views about truth or properties or whatever would force us to put things differently from the way I'm putting it in my discussion, I try to note that so as to try to maintain the neutrality amongst these different views.
Right. Good. I mean, you do end up sort of committing to or arguing for, to some extent, this more like robust view of properties. I mean, you talk about properties as you say, like ways things might be, and the ground, like similarities between things. Although, I mean, I have to admit, as someone who's much more amenable to, I guess, nominalist views about properties, I'm not necessarily against the characterization of properties that you gave there, so long as, ways things that might be can be given appropriate, not nominalistically friendly paraphrase or something like that. But I don't know. Do you think that if someone were a sort of thoroughgoing nominalist about properties, that they could agree with most of the things that you say about realism and naturalism here, and would that be a major stumbling block or a point of contention?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure how I would. Of course, I want to see in detail what the nominalist view is, right? What's the nominalist saying exactly? If the nominalist, nominalism as applied to metaethics might lead to normative conceptualism. I don't know. I don't know exactly, because if the nominalists deny, well, it all depends. So I talk about properties as grounding objective similarities, and I talk about them having essential natures. Well, a nominalist, you might think that a nominalist who's worth his salt, so to speak. I don't know whether that's a good expression, but a nominalist who's doing what he should do would want to be able to explain what that talk comes to in an acceptable way of framing it. So that talk of essences of properties or essences of objective similarities, insofar as all property talk can be eliminated in virtue of talk about words, if that's what the nominalist view really is, then you'd want that kind of talk about essences of properties to be analyzable in terms of talk about words. And then you'd have sort of a two-level reduction, right, or two-level analysis. You'd have so as a nominalist, you might read the book and look at the table, look at the desiderata and say, okay, well, this desideratum that we provide a metaphysical analysis of the nature of normativity, there's a further desideratum of that, namely that talk can be reduced to nominalistically acceptable talk. If it goes that way, then there would be no problem, I guess. I don't see how it would be cashed out, but I would leave it up to the nominalist to do it, right? And if the nominalist could do it, then there'd be no problem being a moral realist and a nominalist. On the other hand, if the nominalist thinks, well, no, I'm just saying what I'm saying, in being a nominalist is that there's no essential nature to properties. There's just ways we talk. Then nominalism would be incompatible with realism, I think. But it would be then, I think, committed to a version of conceptualism, because it would be saying that we just talk about wrongness as a property. We just talk. It's just the way we talk, which is sort of what the conceptualist is saying. So I don't know. It really, I think, the question is whether nominalism about properties is compatible with moral realism, and I guess my answer is, well, it all depends. Depends on what you mean by is. Depends on what you mean by how this nominalist project is going to be carried out.
Right. Yeah. I think that there's probably some room there for a nominalist to do that. After all, if we think that, if a nominalist were to say something like this, okay, I think in the same way that the Earth is, roughly spherical, I don't think there's an additional thing that is the property of sphericity or roughly sphericity or something like that. But all the same, the Earth is roughly spherical. And in an analogous way to that fact, right, there are certain actions that are normatively wrong. But there's not a further thing that is the property of normative wrongness or something like that. Maybe, yeah. And it's not just a matter of the way we speak or something in virtue of which that thing is normatively wrong. In the same way, it's not just a matter of which we speak in virtue of which the sun is, or the Earth is roughly spherical. So maybe, but there's a lot of more details that I might have to explain in order to make sense of it.
Just for example, presumably a nominalist would be happy with the analysis of acidity as a matter of being a proton donor, right? The analysis means to give the essential nature of being an acid. To be an acid is to be a proton donor, right? But that's not that's presumably not incompatible with with nominalism. So maybe in the same way, an analysis of wrongness in naturalistic terms could be made compatible with nominalism.
I was going to say, and this might come up more when we talk about naturalism and natural properties more, as it comes up in chapters 6 and 7 and 8. But I mean, one might think that, if someone someone could be a naturalist about ethics or normativity without being a naturalist in a broader sense, right? They might think that there's various non-natural things or properties. But I think a common motivation for some people to be a naturalist about ethics is because they are a naturalist in a more broad metaphysical sense. And perhaps someone like that, if you think that all that exists in some sense are like, aggregates of matter or like fields or whatever in space-time, then you might want to deny other things like properties in a very robust sense or mathematical objects and so on. And that might lead one to the sort of the nominalist approach or some sort of nominalist approach.
Sure.
And maybe that could be made compatible with most of the stuff you've been saying, or maybe not, but it depends on the details, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it depends on the details. But I think the way you put it in explaining what you meant by nominalism, I think is compatible with the moral naturalism that I'm favoring, because you're not saying that there's just ways we talk. You're saying that there's the way the world is, but the way the world is I don't know, has nothing in it that I don't know, something like there's no such thing as roundness or something, or sphericality, right? But there is the way the world is, that in virtue of which our claim that the Earth is almost spherical is true. And so similarly, you might think, even though there's no such thing as wrongness in any interesting metaphysical sense, still there's ways the world is in virtue of which our claims about wrongness are true. And you might even claim that there's ways the world is in virtue of which our analysis of wrongness and of normativity is correct. Just as I would think a nominalist could allow that to be an acid is to be a proton donor, right? That can come out true, even if you're a nominalist and don't think there's any robust property out there, right? Whatever, so this is where my parity thesis might do some work, in that you'd say, okay, so there's no moral property, there's no property wrongness, but there's no properties in general, right? So the properties that we're the property talk that we engage in ethics is of a par. It's on a par with property talk in other areas, and our metaphysical analyses in ethics are on a par with our metaphysical analyses in other areas. The underlying metaphysics is different from the naive metaphysics that you might have supposed is correct, but that's fine. I think that would be a way to make moral realism compatible with nominalism. But again, it depends on the details, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, good. There's not much point in really exploring that further here, because it's not really the focus. But
there is one thing you said that is important in my overall motivation, which is that I don't want to tie the motivation for being an ethical naturalist to metaphysical naturalism. I don't think you have to be a metaphysical naturalist to be an ethical naturalist any more than because you might believe in God, and you might believe that mathematics can't be explained naturalistically, but still agree that morality can be explained naturalistically, just as people who believe in God and believe in mathematical entities don't have to, reject naturalism about chemistry or naturalism about other fields. So metaphysical naturalism is not, I think, presupposed by moral naturalism.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although, as I said, my impression is that a fair amount of people who do end up going for ethical naturalism do so because of broader naturalist commitments. But as you say, that's not required. Yeah. All right. So in the fifth chapter, you look at some like alternatives to ethical naturalism, and perhaps most importantly, you discuss non-naturalism. Many seem to find this at least a decent amount of people seem to find this kind of appealing view, in that it can affirm ethical realism without having to face the kind of standard issues that naturalism is dealt to face. So, I mean, I don't know. Could you talk a bit about this? Why do you find non-naturalist views broadly like less plausible?
Well, there's a number of different issues, right? But from the point of view of the problem I'm looking at in the book, the main problem is that the main issue is that non-naturalists don't explain what normativity comes to. They just postulate it as an unexplained primitive. So it just is the case that certain properties, the moral properties, have authority over us. They make authoritative demands on us, and that is not explained. The problem of normativity was to explain that, to explain how it could be that a property has this kind of authoritative demand over us. So in effect, the non-naturalist simply says, well, it is the way it is. We can't really explain what normativity comes to. It just is a phenomenon in reality that there are these normative properties. And I don't find that a satisfactory way of dealing with the challenge to explain normativity. There are other standard problems with, more standard problems with non-naturalism. But rather than go into them in this book, I'm focusing on the problem of explaining normativity. So that's the focus of this section, where I criticize non-naturalism. Right, there's standard metaphysical objections and epistemological objections and so on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I could imagine the non-naturalists responding in a couple of ways. One, they could just sort of bite the bullet and say, yeah, okay, I can't explain it anymore, but this is sort of the view that I'm pushed toward because of the problems with naturalist views and because of the, motivation for realism and so on. And I guess a decent chunk of the book is focused on, well, maybe diffusing some of these objections toward naturalism, making it more plausible in those other ways. And it can also offer a solution to the problem of normativity and so on, in a way that other views can. Is that maybe a way to think about it?
Right. The 9th chapter is concerned with objections. I think I focus on 9 main objections in that chapter, objections to naturalism, that is. And in other sections, I talk about other objections that are more specific to particular versions of naturalism. So I think so one of the familiar ones is the just too different objection, which we can talk about at some point if you want to. But if we take the problem of explaining normativity seriously and the challenge to realist theories of all kinds that they're unable to explain normativity seriously, then non-naturalism faces a problem. And in fact, non-naturalists typically object to naturalism because they think that naturalism can't explain normativity. They think, it's just too different from normative properties are just too different from ordinary natural properties. They couldn't possibly be ordinary natural properties. Well, okay, so why are they so different? Well, because they're normative, right? So if it's okay for non-naturalists to kind of just slide over the problem of explaining normativity, it should be all right for naturalists to do that. I don't think it is all right, though. I think this is a philosophical puzzle, and we, as philosophers, should do our best to deal with that puzzle, it seems to me.
Yeah, and then another sort of reply I could imagine a non-naturalist trying to give anyway is that, well, maybe non-naturalism is compatible with a further sort of explanation of where sort of normativity comes from. Maybe we don't have it yet, but it's not obvious that it rules it out necessarily. So I don't know. Maybe that's something that they could explore. I mean, what do you think about the prospect of that sort of reply?
Well, I leave that open as a possibility. And it is true that non-naturalists give something of an explanation, typically, in that they they contend that all normativity reduces to facts. All normative facts reduce to facts about reasons. And a typical non-naturalist would be a reasons firster, a guy who thinks that all normativity is a matter of the reasons that there are, or Some non-naturalists are values firsters who think that all normativity is a matter of what values there are. But values and reasons themselves are normative entities. They're supposed to be the kernel of all normativity. So, so even if we have an account that reduces all normative phenomena to facts about reasons or facts about value, we still haven't really explained what normativity comes to, because we haven't explained what the normativity of reasons comes to, or what the normativity of these values comes to. So there are attempts by non-naturalists to give some kind of an account, but they end up still postulating a primitive element of normativity in the nature of things, and so they're still primitivist. Now, whether they could avoid primitivism somehow, that's something I leave open, but I don't see what the strategy would be. Typically, non-naturalists think of the non-natural properties as being essentially normative ones. That's why they take it that explaining normativity in terms by postulating these non-natural properties gets to what normativity consists in, because there just are these non-natural normative properties in the nature of things. But maybe somebody could explain normativity without primitivism and without naturalism. I just don't see anybody really attempting that, and I don't know what such a strategy would come to. So I leave that open, but I don't have much hope of seeing that approach taken up.
Yeah, and I wonder, it makes me think that if they try to take this sort of primitivist view approach and say, okay, maybe we can give a non-naturalist account of the normative in other terms, or in terms of other facts and so on, I worry that actually might be undermined by some of the motivations they give for non-naturalism in the first place. Because, I don't know, maybe this isn't right, but I sometimes get the feeling that some of the motivations for non-naturalism they're not problems with naturalism per se. They're just a more general problem with analyzing the normative in non-normative terms. And if you do that, it doesn't matter where you do that in naturalist terms or non-naturalist ones. Some of the arguments against, non-primitivism really would remain the same. Do you see what I'm saying there? Does that sound
good?
Right?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Right. Typically, they think that normativity can't be reduced. Problem with naturalism is that it tries to reduce normativity to something non-normative. But that problem would reappear if you tried to handle us all within the non-natural realm. You'd be trying to reduce normativity to something non-natural. The fact that you'd be trying to reduce normativity to something that wasn't itself essentially normative, and the problem would reappear, even though you were trying to stay on the non-naturalist side of things. I think that's right.
Right. Yeah. In this chapter, you cover a few other approaches to normativity. I'm not going to cover all of them. I'm not going to cover all of them right now, but maybe if we talked a little bit about error theory. So, sure. According to error theory, the basic idea is that the error theorist agrees with the realist about the kind of moral semantics, at least broadly. We are trying to make realist claims about ethical properties and normativity more generally, but they just all go wrong. There's just no moral facts or properties of the sort people take there to be. And so, I guess it's sort of obvious by now, but what do you think are the sort of shortcomings of this reply?
It's just very hard to believe, right? It's very, for one thing, the arguments in favor of it, I think, fall flat, because they typically involve assuming that normativity has to amount to a certain thing, which itself is extremely puzzling. And they claim that, there can't be anything like that in reality. So they conclude that there's no such thing as normativity in reality. But the argument depends on taking normativity to be this strange thing, this strange type of thing. And I think those arguments fall flat, because I think that normativity can be given a naturalistic analysis whereby it's not anything strange. That another way to put this is that I think that motivation for error theory really boils down to a rejection of other possibilities. You know, you're rejecting non-naturalism, and you're rejecting naturalism, and you're rejecting expressivism. So if you reject all those, but you're tempted by a realist semantics, then you're led to error theory. But I think if it could be shown that there was a satisfactory version of naturalism, a satisfactory way of accounting for the nature of normativity within a naturalistic perspective, that would take the wind out of the sails of the error theory. So in a way, the answer to error theory is, number one, it seems highly implausible. It's hard to accept. But number two, here's a way to diffuse the motivation for it by giving an account of normativity in naturalistic terms. So the whole book is, in a way, a response to the error theory.
Right. Yeah. One of the authors you mentioned in that section is Jonas Olsson, and he's sort of pushed towards an error theory because, well, he doesn't think that normativity can be given or can be made compatible with naturalism.
Right.
And well, if he thought that it could, as you argue in this book, well, maybe he would be. Maybe he wouldn't accept the error theory. Yeah.
Right. The most famous argument for the error theory is John Mackey's argument from queerness, which turns on the idea that normativity would be something queer of a kind that you couldn't find in the natural world. The answer to that is to try and give an account that's not queer, and that's what I try to show the way to do in this book.
Right. I mean, if we thought that realism was really only committing to us to the sort of natural properties we take to exist anyway, then who would be an error theorist about that? I mean, the issue is about what the commitments are to, or what actually has to exist for these claims to be correct.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I guess we could touch a little bit on like expressivism or other like non-cognitivist views.
Sure.
What do you think about? I mean, this is largely a claim about the moral semantics, right? That they're not actually making a propositional assertion. They're expressing some non-cognitive attitude, like pleasure or disgust, or like approval or disapproval or something like that.
Yeah.
There's different ways to be a non-cognitivist, but that's usually the most common way to put it. What do you think are some of the issues with this approach?
Right. Well, there are technical issues that have been much discussed in the literature. I try to largely stay away from those issues because I think there are technical issues and there are technical ways to respond to the issues, and I just I want to avoid getting into the weeds about those issues in the book. I try to focus on what I think are more basic problems with non-cognitivist expressivism, and even the semantic issues I think are technical in a way that I want to avoid. So I don't want to really. I mean, okay, so I do think that when we make a moral claim, like abortion is always wrong, or abortion is sometimes permissible, or whatever, that we're making a propositional claim. So I don't accept the semantics behind non-cognitivism. But I think in a way more fundamental is that these states of mind that we're in when we have moral convictions, I think are beliefs. I don't think it's plausible that they are simply attitudes. There might be attitudes that are bound up with these beliefs, but I think that they're beliefs. Right, so that a person who, I think I give the example in the book of a person who, well, let's just say we'd ordinarily say believes that torture is wrong, but it's all too common, right? It's all too widespread. Torture is wrong, but widespread. That state of mind it's surely just one kind of state. It's just the person has this belief. It'd be. On the non-cognitive view, there's really two different states of mind there. There's a belief that torture is widespread, and there's then combined with it an attitude, which is a fundamentally different kind of state of mind, an attitude of opposition to torture. Now, I think a person who believes that torture is wrong does have an opposition to torture. And when you express your belief that torture is wrong, you do, I think, express opposition to torture. But that's not fundamentally what's going on there. I think fundamentally what's going on there is that you're expressing a belief, a state of mind of the same sort as ordinary beliefs, so that we can reason about them in the way we reason about ordinary beliefs. We can combine them with other beliefs in the way that we ordinarily do with other beliefs to reach further beliefs, and so on. And this is something that the non-cognitivist really struggles to explain. So I think that in a way the issue that I focus on in this section is more to do with the states of mind of people who have moral beliefs than it is, or not to beg the question, I shouldn't call them beliefs, but the state of mind of a person who has a moral conviction, I want to say, is a belief, and to think otherwise is very unintuitive, and I think it also doesn't mesh with the theory of the mind, with a plausible theory of the mind, and of how reasoning takes place in the mind. So it's for these reasons that I think non-cognitivism is implausible. Of course, on top of that, it also implies that there's not really anything in the world that amounts to that the wrongness of torture consists in. It's just that we have fundamentally, it's just that we have an attitude of disapproval of certain things, including torture. And that, I think, is difficult to accept also. So when one thinks that torture is wrong, you're not thinking that, oh, it's just a matter of my having a certain opposition to torture. You're thinking that there's something about torture as it is in itself that you're trying to focus on and talk about, and talking about its wrongness.
Right. Yeah, and some of the stuff you bring up there, I mean, you didn't mention the Frege-Geach problem explicitly, but I mean, that's this issue of embedding and how you can appear to make inferences involving moral or ethical statements, at least is a serious problem. Maybe there's a way around it for the non-cognitivists, but at least is a serious problem for the view, because they seem to be operating both in the way we believe and infer things and reason and so on as propositions, as beliefs.
Right. I think so. Yeah. So the Frege-Geach problem becomes quite technical, and they're technical fixes that people proposed, but they're all sort of epicycles on the ordinary way of thinking about our own mind and how our minds work. And I think that places a burden on non-cognitivism that non-naturalist positions just don't have. So again, I think that the motivation for non-cognitivism would evaporate if one thought that a plausible naturalist theory could be developed. So again, in a way, the whole book is an answer to non-cognitivism.
I might have asked a similar question earlier, but what do you think of the potential approach which doesn't take a kind of unified view of the moral semantics? So let me put this another way. So maybe sometimes when people employ moral terms, they're using them in an expressivist way, but maybe sometimes they're using them in a normal cognitivist way, and maybe there's not a sort of single, like, simple semantic analysis to be given of moral thought and talk. I mean, it's an empirical issue, I guess, but I mean, what do you think about that as a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility, and it is true that context makes a big difference to how we interpret what somebody says, right? So if we're talking about, let's see, if we're anthropologists talking about the moral views of people in some remote part of the world, we might say this is wrong, this is right, and so on and so forth. But there we're not meaning to make a normative claim. We're meaning to make a descriptive claim, and the context makes that clear. Similarly, if we're watching a baseball game and the pitcher does something that violates the rule of baseball, we might say that's wrong. But there again, we wouldn't be meaning to make a moral claim or even a claim of any normative weight. We'd rather be simply making a remark based on the rules of baseball, presumably. So it could be that, as you say, it could be that there are contexts in which a person uses moral vocabulary to express a kind of non-cognitive state of mind. So let's see if I can think of an example. Well, I should think that we can think of examples, but let's see. We're I don't know. We're having a conversation outside a bar, right? And somebody insults another person, right? And you say, "That's wrong. That's just wrong," right? You may simply be expressing your shock at what the person did, and that might be indicated. That might be something that's clear in the context that you don't mean to be. You don't mean to be. I mean, you could be interpreted as saying, "Well, that's rude," or you could be interpreted as saying that's morally wrong. But on the other hand, you might simply be expressing shock and using the word wrong in that context as a way of expressing your shock. So yeah, I think there could be, once we bear in mind the effect that context has on our semantic interpretation of what people say, I think you could be right that there are contexts in which these terms are used in a non-cognitivist way. Yeah.
Right. Fair enough. Okay, so in the sixth chapter, you look more deeply at the notion of natural properties, and sort of somewhat famously, I guess, a rigorous characterization of the natural properties has been, well, it's proven kind of difficult.
Right.
And yeah, as I understand it, you end up preferring a kind of epistemic conception that natural properties are those that we could learn about through experience, including empirical observation and induction. Why do you think this is? Why do you sort of prefer this approach and to thinking about natural properties? Maybe you can expand on it too.
Yeah, sure. So I don't try to give an analysis of what it is for a property to be a natural one. I don't actually know what such an analysis would look like. I mean, when you think about the nature of the natural world, where we have everything from quantum mechanical phenomena, including weird apparent action at a distance, everything from that to the physics of baseball and fashion and all that there is in the natural world and all its variety. It'd be very hard, I think, to say what all these phenomena have in common at a fundamental metaphysical level. But I think the reason that I end up with the epistemic account, which I describe as a characterization rather than an analysis of what naturalism consists in, is that I think this account answers to the basic intuition that we have when we're motivated to be naturalists, which is that the natural world is the world around us. It's the world that we observe. It's the world that we live in. It's the world that science studies. It's the world that we learn about through using our eyes and our ears and our hands and so on and so forth. It includes all these phenomena that I listed before, from matters of fashion to matters of quantum mechanics. And, what they have fundamentally in common at a metaphysical level, I don't think I can say, but it does seem to me that there are things we can learn about empirically. And that's I think, the best that I can do by way of giving a characterization. And it fits with the sort of, with the history of the field. So you look at G.E. Moore. Moore says something like, the naturalist is the person who thinks that all properties are empirical ones that we learn about through science and induction, something like that. So it's this type of characterization has a pedigree, and I think it answers to the intuitions that motivate people to be naturalists. So just for example, I was chatting this morning with a guy who's fundamentally, in a way, a physicist. He's not a professional physicist, but he did an MA in physics and thought about physics, still thinks about physics, and he's always sort of bemused when I tell him that I'm thinking about ethics and about trying to develop a naturalistic view, because he thinks that fundamentally our knowledge is all empirical, and that's what he wants. That's what he sort of is challenging me to give, an account of ethics that grounds out in the empirical. So I think that this answers to the intuitions that motivate naturalism, and that's why I end up there.
Yeah, good. I mean, one thing that I like about this is that, well, you don't have to employ some, I think, potentially murky or unclear metaphysical notions. Like I'm kind of critical of certain like grounding talk, and I wouldn't want to use a criterion like that in order to express the view that I have. Although, on the other hand, and this is an objection you consider, by making the distinction rely on this epistemic condition, well, it shouldn't be something epistemic. Whether something is natural or non-natural should be some like metaphysical concern, not something that depends on, I don't know, how we can know things or something like that. I mean, what do you make of this worry?
I think that's right. That ideally, we'd be able to give a metaphysical characterization of the natural, but for one thing, I don't think anybody's succeeded in doing it, and I don't know how to do it. And furthermore, nothing in the epistemic criterion that I give rules out there being something in common, metaphysically in common, to all things that can end up being classified as natural on my account. So it could be that there's something that all empirically tractable properties have in common metaphysically. I don't know what it is, but it could well be. And I would assume that there is, but I don't know what it is again. So, but since I offer this as a characterization rather than as an analysis of the natural, I don't think it's that what you're saying is an objection. It's more a complaint that I haven't gotten to the bottom of things and explaining what the natural consists in. And I agree, I haven't gotten to the bottom of things. But that's fine. I don't think anybody else has, and I don't know how to do it. And that's not really the goal of the book. The goal of the book is to explain how we can give an account of ethics that's naturalistic. And I think all that we need to do that is a criterion that picks out the natural from the non-natural. I think that's enough to do what I want to do.
Right. And what about this sort of objection which says that, okay, but what if, like, maybe we could learn about things or properties which would normally be counted as non-natural, but like sort of indirectly. I don't know, like maybe we think, if we think that a God is supposed to be a kind of non-natural thing, but it can have an impact on the world in various ways, and we can detect that, and so learn sort of indirectly about this non-natural thing. Would that make this thing like God natural, or it seems like the wrong result? Do you see the sort of objection I'm getting at here? What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's another good objection. So what I think about that is that there are views about God that are natural. They're even described as natural theology, I think. So the idea would be that we know, the argument from design is supposed to be an argument that's based in empirical observation. We observe all this stuff around us. We hold that this couldn't possibly, all this stuff and all its wonderful variety couldn't have arisen by any sort of process that we're familiar with from the natural world. So we postulate the existence of a highly powerful being that we suppose has created this world to explain what we observe. That would be a kind of naturalistic theory of God. I mean, I think it's an unsuccessful theory, but I think we should classify that as a naturalistic theory. So I suppose similarly, somebody who's a non-naturalist could say that that moral properties can have causal consequences in the world. So, for example, Hitler's being an evil person was responsible for Hitler's behavior. And so Hitler's evil had causal consequences. And so you might think that shows that Hitler's being evil was a natural property. So, but that's not something that a non-naturalist, non-naturalism is in a kind of pickle if it tries to argue in that way, because then it amounts to saying that the moral properties are natural ones. And then then the door is open for a naturalist to try and give a naturalistic account of what those properties are like.
Yeah. I mean, I could see a non-naturalist maybe objecting to this characterization of the naturalism, the characterization of natural properties, because I mean, maybe they want to say, yeah, we could learn about these things about, Hitler being evil or whatever. But all the same, that property is something wholly like apart from the natural world or something like that, and so should be considered non-natural. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe then they would have to consider how they're characterizing the non-natural distinction there, and
right,
sort of compare the views.
That would be the issue. What exactly would that sort of account want to say about the nature of the natural? And often people will say the sort of thing that Jonas Olson does, which is that these properties are irreducible. If there are any such properties, they would be irreducible. And non-naturalists typically think that the ethical properties are irreducible. So they might say, well, these things have causal consequences when they're instantiated, and so we can learn about them empirically. So on your account, pointing at me, they count as natural properties, but hey, they're not reducible to natural properties. But there is a view that I think is clearly a naturalistic view that takes the moral properties to be irreducible, or at least as friendly to the idea that the moral properties are irreducible. So, at this point in the debate, we enter the terrain of a terrain that's unstable, because we no longer have a settled conception of what the natural consists in.
Right. Yeah. I see that. That makes sense. So, yeah. Also in this chapter, you talk a bit about how you want to analyze normativity as a kind of complex, structured property or condition. I don't know. Can you talk a bit about this view and how you think about normative properties here?
Okay. Are you're talking about the next chapter, maybe? It doesn't matter what chapter.
I think this was still in chapter 6. In my notes. I have this for chapter 6, but
okay. Well, anyway, so I was thinking it doesn't matter what chapter it is, of course.
Yeah.
But I think we're talking about chapter 7, but whatever. Right. So I think that what a naturalist should aim to do is to give an account of what the essential nature of normative properties and the essential nature of normativity by reference to properties that such that the ones that constitute normativity are not themselves normative, although the complex that they enter into that analyzes normativity would be normative. So an analog is that I use in the book is the analysis of being an acid as being a proton donor. So being a donor is not to be an acid. Being a proton is not to be an acid, but this complex property of being a proton donor, that is what it is to be an acid. So similarly, I want to say a successful analysis of normativity and of the nature of the normative properties would postulate that there's some complex property consisting in elements, none of which are themselves normative, but where the overall complex is the analysans of this property of normativity that we want to give an analysis of. Right, so that's the picture. But you had something more specific you wanted to ask about that picture, I think.
Yeah. But then that complex of natural properties would itself be a natural property itself as well, right?
That's the idea. Yeah.
Right.
So just as the property of being an acid, that is the property of being a proton donor, is itself a natural property. In that, for one thing, we can detect acids empirically, and for another thing, the components of the property are natural properties that we can detect empirically, and the relation that holds those properties together in the property being an acid, that's the relation of, I don't know, being a proton donor, being a donor of, I guess, is the relation. And that itself is, again, something that we can detect empirically. So the idea would be to provide an analysis of the property of, the idea is that there are normative properties like wrongness, and in being normative, they have this further property of being normative, right? So we want to give an analysis of normativity, that is to say, an analysis of the property of being normative that wrongness has and virtueness has, and so on and so forth. So what is this property of being normative? What does it consist in? The goal is to give an account of what that property consists in, but where the elements of the property are not themselves normative. If they were, we wouldn't be really giving a fundamental analysis. We'd be just sort of going in circles, explaining something normative by reference to something else normative.
Right. You wouldn't have necessarily avoided a kind of primitivism there.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Whereas, here you're getting both naturalism, that they are ethical properties are natural properties, and also they can be reduced or explained in terms of maybe more basic non-natural, non-normative or not essentially normative properties.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Good.
So that's the goal, anyway.
Yeah. Though that's, maybe we'll get to this a bit more, but I can see how that's the goal, but getting there is sort of difficult. I mean, it's like, what would you give as an analysis of that sort for some normative property? Like, what is the property of wrongness, for example, going to look like in those terms? That's sort of, maybe this is the sort of thing that people have most issue with. It's like, I can't even imagine what that would look like,
Right. Well, that's the goal. Let's see. So in chapter 8, I run through 5 different naturalist types of theory that are naturalist, and argue that at least 2 of them don't provide satisfactory explanations of what normativity consists in. So I set them aside, even because although they're naturalist theories, what I'm after is a naturalistic account of what normativity consists in, and they don't provide that. So I set those 2 theories aside, which leaves 3 theories, where I think each of them purports to offer an analysis of what normativity consists in. And in chapter 10, I try to make that explicit. So chapter 8 talks about the 3 theories that I think have a chance. One is subjectivist neo-Humean naturalism. Another is neo-Aristotelian naturalism. And third is my own. Of course, I had to include my own here, pluralist teleology. And then after discussing objections and replies in chapter 9, in chapter 10, I try to make explicit what these different theories would be saying is the analysis of normativity. So we can go to that if you want, or talk. I don't know how you want to proceed here, but
that's great. Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions before we get into those particular varieties there. So something else for chapter 7. There you explore some of the various aspects of ethical naturalism, in particular focusing on the relationship between ethical properties and natural properties. And so maybe the most significant one is that we might ask whether natural properties are constituted by, identical to, reducible to, or grounded in natural properties. I take it from what you've been saying already that, ethical properties in some sense are identical to natural properties, and also in a way reducible to other natural properties. Is that right? Is that the right way?
Yeah, that's right. That's the basic idea.
Yeah. I mean, I was wondering, because it almost doesn't make sense. Maybe it would on different accounts of the natural, but it almost doesn't make sense to think about ethical properties to be a moral naturalist, but think that no, ethical properties aren't identical to any natural properties. They're just grounded in them, or another way, and in some way we're a non-reductive moral naturalist. I have to confess that that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I guess I don't really understand that. I mean, if they are natural, then they're among the natural properties. I don't know. If there's something else, then I'm not sure what that's supposed to be. If that's, I don't know. Do you share that sort of perspective, or what do you think about non-reductive accounts?
I understand what you're saying. So the Cornell naturalists have to be careful here not to mischaracterize their view, but so I'll put it in a way that I think is wrong ultimately, but it's might be the easiest way to make sharp what you're worried about. So you can imagine somebody who was tempted by Cornell naturalism going a bit further and saying, okay, the moral properties are natural properties, but not identical to any complex of natural properties that we can identify. So they're properties that we refer to using normative terminology. They're natural properties, but we can't provide an interesting, informative analysis of their nature in using naturalistic terms, right? That would be a possible view. And I don't think any naturalist would say that what you were saying, which is that the properties aren't natural. I'm a naturalist. I think what might be said is that the moral properties are natural properties, but they can't be reduced to any complex of other natural properties. So they're irreducible, but natural. Now, the Cornell realists don't actually say that, as I understand it. They say that it may well be the case that they're irreducible, and that wouldn't be an objection to taking them to be natural properties, right? So if that's the case, then consider the scenario in which we do reach the conclusion that the moral properties are not reducible to any complex of other natural properties which are themselves non-normative. Then we'd have the position I think you were worried about, which is that these properties are natural but not reducible to or explicable in terms of any other natural properties, certainly not non-normative ones. I think that's what was worrying you. I think that makes sense. It's just that it's not very satisfactory or satisfying philosophically, because well, for one thing, it doesn't show us how to answer the challenge about normativity. It doesn't give us a way to explain what normativity consists in. That view basically, that sort of a radical view, non-reductionist view, would amount to saying that, that the moral properties are normative, but we can't say what that consists in. It's just, so in that respect, it would be a primitivist kind of naturalism. And it wouldn't have an interesting advantage, I don't think, over non-naturalism. It would have something of an advantage because the epistemology would be a naturalistic epistemology on my account of what makes for on my criterion of the natural. This kind of naturalism would have to say that our knowledge of the moral properties, our ethical knowledge, is empirically grounded. So the epistemology would be not special, but the metaphysics would be unexplained. We wouldn't have an explanation of what normativity consists in. So it's for that reason that I think that Cornell realism is not a satisfactory theory, not because I think it's unintelligible or that it's not really a naturalistic theory or that it's not attractive. It's just that it doesn't explain what normativity consists in. So if we come to this subject matter hoping to understand what normativity consists in, we're not going to be satisfied by the Cornell realists' position.
Right. Yeah, that seems pretty fair. And then another thing I want to bring up, I think this might be from chapter 8, but you also discussed the Supervenience thesis, So basically, the basic idea of supervenience as it relates to the moral and the descriptive is that, you can't have a difference in the moral facts without some difference in the descriptive facts, or, put another way, any worlds which are the same descriptively are the same morally. Right. And you accept this, and I take it you think of it almost as like an a priori truth. I wonder though, is it really that obvious? I mean, there are a variety of possible metaethical views which at least appear to allow for violations of supervenience. I don't know, we could think there's some sort of non-naturalism is true, where there's just these like brute moral facts or properties that could have been different, even if the descriptive facts were the same. Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about supervenience and why you take it to be kind of a priori truth.
Well, it is true that some people have questioned the supervenience thesis, but if you're looking for something that's so widely accepted amongst moral philosophers as to count as consensus view, this would be the consensus view. I think this would be probably the only candidate consensus view, which is that the moral supervenes on the natural. So it could be doubted, but it's very widely accepted. Why would I accept it? I just I guess this just comes down to sort of maybe it's just a brute psychological fact about me and what I could find plausible, but I can't see how it could be plausible, or how anybody could think it plausible, that say somebody's assertion would be a wrongful lie in one complex empirical state in one world, right? Whereas in a world that's identical to that world, that same assertion would not have been a wrongful lie, but would have been the truth, or would have been a lie but not wrongful. I mean, I just don't see how that can make sense. Why would it be? The natural question that would be to ask would be, well, why is it wrong here but not wrong there? You say John Lennon is dead in this world, and it's true. You say John Lennon is dead in this other world, and it's a wrongful lie. Well, in that world, it would be a wrongful lie because John Lennon is not dead, right? But we're looking now at a case where, hold everything else constant. John Lennon's life story, your life story, my life story, everything that's happened in the world is held constant. But the remark that John Lennon is dead is a wrongful lie in one world like that, but not a wrongful lie in another world like that. The natural question to ask is, well, why is it wrongful in this world but not in that world, when everything's just the same otherwise? There'd be no answering that question, right? And so it's, to my mind, that would make it completely mysterious how it could be the case that the lie is wrongful in one, the remark is a wrongful lie in one world but not a wrongful lie in the other, when there's nothing. Be completely mysterious. And if we accept that that's possible, although completely mysterious, essentially I think we'd be committed to saying that the moral is really mysterious. Yeah, there's just a mystery at the bottom of things, because the moral truth is not in any way on this view, the moral truth would not be in any way, I think, accountable to the other facts to the non-moral facts about the world, right? So it would be completely mysterious how in virtue of what these facts obtained. Now, non-naturalists, as you point out, non-naturalists postulate this world, this sort of realm of non-natural moral properties, and it would seem, as you suggested, something they need to explain, why it couldn't be that the moral properties vary even if the non-moral facts in the world don't, right? Why couldn't it be if the so if you're a non-naturalist, you might be challenged to explain why it couldn't be that it would be a wrongful lie to say John Lennon is alive in the actual world as it actually is, but not wrong to say that in another world is exactly like the actual world except for this difference in the moral facts. Why couldn't it be like that if the moral properties are non-natural ones that don't in any way metaphysically depend on the natural properties? And that in fact was a kind of challenge to non-naturalism that was raised by Simon Blackburn. But I think it's a challenge to non-naturalism. It's not a position that a non-naturalist would want to embrace, because embracing it would make it simply mysterious, would make the moral facts simply mysterious. They would. I mean, they're already mysterious enough on a non-naturalist position. So you might say, well, why not embrace this further mystery? But non-naturalists aren't embracing mystery just for the sake of having a mysterious position, right? They think that they're forced to postulate non-natural properties, as forced to suppose that the moral properties are non-natural ones because of other things that they're committed to. They don't want to go. I think very few of them would want to go to this further step of denying supervenience.
Right. Yeah, and there's maybe a further epistemic worry if you deny supervenience as well, right? Because if all the descriptive facts would be the same, yet the ethical facts completely different, well, how do we know which world we're in? I mean, there's nothing really to go on to decide it. It's maybe a worry there as well.
The non-naturalists are going to want to postulate moral principles like intentionally stating a falsehood is wrong or something, or torturing people is wrong. They're going, or a non-naturalist might be a consequentialist and say that actions that are wrong in virtue of failing to maximize the general happiness or something like that. So they typically will suppose that there are principles that connect the natural facts about actions and people and circumstances to their moral evaluation, and that itself puts a block in place of denying supervenience.
Yeah, it does also remind me, you discuss in the book a bit of the work of Frank Jackson and his analytic functionalism and stuff, but this also reminds me of something he's endorsed, a kind of quote-unquote direct argument from, basically it involves supervenience plus this intentionalist thesis, which says that, like, look, if two properties are necessarily coextensive, like if something has property F, then it has property G, and if it has property G, then it has property F, then F and G are the same property. And so it argues from that, plus supervenience, for thinking that, well, therefore we just conclude that the ethical properties are natural properties. Would you endorse this sort of argument as well, or what do you think about the force of that?
Well, I do discuss that argument in chapter 8, I guess.
Must be chapter 8, yeah.
Yeah. And let's see. That's a clever argument. It's a cool argument. But I think the problem with it is that it's supposed to start from this consensus view that supervenience is the case, that the moral supervenes on the natural, and argue from that to naturalism. But a crucial premise in the argument is this view about the nature of properties, the one that you just described, that necessarily coextensive properties are identical. So on this view, the property of being trilateral and the property of being triangular are one and the same. There's only the one property, which we can call triangularity or trilaterality. It doesn't matter what we call it, but it's the same property, just the one property. So that's a premise in the argument, and I think it's problematic. I think it's one that non-naturalists wouldn't accept. So that the argument won't persuade non-naturalists. The reason they won't accept it, I think, is because they have a view of, I think, and a plausible view of properties that that properties are not just the properties are ground objective similarities amongst things. So the reason why triangularity and trilaterality are different properties is that triangular things are similar in respect of the number of angles. Trilateral things are similar with respect to the number of sides. So it might be that trilateral things and triangular figures are necessarily one and the same, that a triangular figure and a trilateral figure. So the triangular figures, figures, it might well be the case, as I suppose it is, that triangles are necessarily trilaterals and vice versa. But the similarities in virtue of which something is a triangle is different from the similarities in virtue with something is a trilateral. So plausibly, and on this basis, if you have this particular view about what properties are, you'll conclude that they're different properties. And I think that non-naturalists and most naturalists too would reject the theory of property identification that Jackson's argument relies on. As you can see, if you think about the viability of a position that says, for example, that actions are wrong if and only if they fail to maximize the general happiness, right? So there's a case where somebody who holds that the property of being wrong and the property of being such as to fail to maximize the general happiness are necessarily coextensive. An action is wrong if and only if it fails to maximize the general happiness. But a non-naturalist can hold that without being committed to naturalism, and holding that view doesn't commit you to naturalism. So I think that the argument, as clever as it is, rests on a conception of property identification that's too generous to make plausible the non-naturalist position.
Yeah. What if the argument was, or weakened, or someone gave a sort of weaker version, which said something like, okay, maybe it doesn't entail that coextensive properties are identical, but the coextensiveness at least provides some decent, defeasible evidence for coextensiveness. And when we find that, these natural and moral properties are coextensive in these ways broadly and almost systematically, and we don't have good reason to deny their identification, that itself is just some decent evidence for it. What do you think about I guess it's a sort of weaker version, probabilistic, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's plausible. Necessary coextensiveness is you could say evidence of identity. I mean, identical properties have to be coextensive, right? I mean, if you only got one property, then it can't fail to be coextensive with itself, right? So if you find what seem to be two properties that are necessarily coextensive, then you have some reason to think that perhaps you're dealing with just one property. But the example of triangularity and trilaterality shows that there isn't an entailment from necessary coextensiveness to identity. Right. It goes in one direction, but not the other.
Right. Okay, good. So now I guess we could turn to in I think we're still in chapter 8 here. Those three candidate naturalist views that you want to discuss that potentially can offer an analysis of normativity. So yeah, I guess we can start with subjectivist neo-Humean naturalism and analyze this normativity in terms of reasons and especially with desires. So yeah, I don't know if you want to explain this view and how it offers a potential solution to the problems being discussed.
Yeah. So the basic idea is that all normativity reduces to reasons, or it can be analyzed in terms of facts about reasons, and for something to be a reason, that the property that something can have of being a reason for somebody to do something can be analyzed in terms of a property that relates desires to actions and so on. So let's see if I can. So Mark Schroeder gives what I think is the sort of best version of the basic position here. And if I've got it right, it says something like, well, he has the example of, there's dancing at a party, and can't now remember the names of the people in an example, but
I think it was Ronnie.
Oh, yeah, Ronnie and whatever. So Ronnie likes dancing.
Bradley, yeah.
Ronnie and Bradley, yeah. So Ronnie, yeah, okay, good. So Ronnie likes dancing. Let's say, maybe I've got them backwards, but it doesn't matter. Ronnie likes dancing. There's going to be dancing at the party. So it seems like intuitively, the fact that there's going to be dancing at the party and Ronnie likes dancing means that Ronnie has a reason to go to the party. How does that come out on the analysis? Well, Schroeder has this view he calls hypotheticalism, which says that a fact is a reason for somebody to do something if that person has a desire such that that fact explains why the action in question would tend to satisfy the desire. So in Ronnie's case, the fact that there's dancing at the party is a reason for Ronnie to go to the party because Ronnie has a desire, namely the desire to dance. And the fact that there's dancing at the party explains why going to the party would tend to increase the chances of his satisfying his desire. So the analysis says Ronnie has a reason to go to the dance or to the party. Bradley, on the other hand, Bradley doesn't like dancing. So it appears intuitively that the fact that there'll be dancing at the party is not a reason for Bradley to go to the party. Why? Well, because Bradley doesn't like dancing. And so the fact that there will, maybe might be simpler if we suppose Bradley hates dancing, right? So the fact that there'll be dancing at the party is not a reason for, maybe it's a reason for Bradley to stay away from the party because Bradley has a desire, namely the desire to avoid dancing, such that staying away from the party will be a way for him to avoid frustrating his desire to not dance or something like that. I may have botched up stating that, but the basic idea is that intuitively there's a difference between Ronnie and Bradley, even in these worlds where there's dancing at the party, and the reason there's a difference in their reasons is that there's a difference in their desires, right? For Ronnie, because he desires to go to dance, the fact that there'll be dancing at the party is a reason to go there. And for Bradley, because he hates dancing, the fact that there'll be dancing at the party is a reason for him not to go to the party. Seems very plausible that this difference in their desires explains a difference in their reasons. And these reasons intuitively are, they're real reasons. They're not like the reasons in games. It's not. So we talked before, I think last time we talked about the difference between merely formal normativity and authoritative normativity. And although, it's very debatable what that difference comes to, and I didn't provide an analysis of the difference. I did point at ways to mark out the difference, and what we have here, I think, is pretty clearly, given the way I described that, the difference between formal and authoritative reasons is pretty clearly this is an authoritative reason, not merely a formal one. It's not like merely there's some conventional game such that it counts in favor of going to the party. That it's rather that given the kind of person that Ronnie is, with the kinds of desires that Ronnie has, there's a consideration that rightly moves him would rightly move him to go to the party. He'd be making a mistake of some normative significance if he ignored the fact that there'll be dancing at the party and deciding what to do, given that he likes dancing. And similarly, Bradley would be making a mistake of some normative significance were he to ignore the fact that they'll be dancing at the party in deciding what to do, given that he hates dancing. So I think we have here a plausible case of authoritative reasons, which is given a kind of plausible explanation in Mark Schroeder's account. So that's the most simple example of the Humean position. There are idealized versions and so on and so forth that we could talk about if you want, but that's the simplest version. And I think it does give us a handle on explaining normativity. There's some drawbacks to it, but it does give us a handle on explaining normativity. So I think it's a starter.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I did want to mention one of the sort of drawbacks that you discuss, and we can move on to the other two. Maybe the most obvious worry about this view is that, well, it's a subjectivist view, and it seems to make the reasons and the normativity just dependent on like our desires and states like that, which I don't know, it feels like we've lost the categoricity and the we would think that it should be authoritative and binding regardless of our own sort of personal desires or whims or anything like that. So, I mean, that's maybe a worry. I mean, what do you think about this kind of worry that is not really objective, it's not really categorical if it's subjective in this way?
Right. Well, I think some people would say it's not a realist position because of what you're pointing to. To my mind, it's that's a don't care. I mean, I think I want to have a realist position, but at this point, I'm not going to object because of that categorization of the theory. I think the objection you're pointing to isn't simply that it's not realist. It's that substantively you think it's not adequate because it doesn't give us an account of what we're looking for, which is a kind of normativity that is independent of our particular attitudes. So the best example perhaps is moral reasons, but there are also reasons grounded in people's needs. So I would say that if given that the people in Gaza need food, there's a reason to get food to them, and there's a reason for them to seek food, and that doesn't depend on our desires. That reason doesn't depend on our desires. It doesn't exist only because of our desires. We have that reason because of their needs. Now, you might think their needs reflect their desires, and presumably the people there that are suffering do want to have relief of their suffering. But I think the important point there is they're suffering, not that they want to have relief of their suffering. So it seems to me that these reasons grounded in needs are non-subjective in the right kind of way, that what we're looking for, and that the neo-Humean subjectivist view doesn't capture that. Now that was a moral reason as well as a reason grounded in needs. So it did it served both purposes. But I think we could put it that way, this other way, that it doesn't really accommodate, this kind of view doesn't really accommodate moral reasons. Now, to be fair, Schroeder does attempt to broaden his account so that it can accommodate moral reasons, but I think in a way that's, well, I mean, we could go into the weeds, I suppose, but I think it doesn't do this in a satisfactory kind of way. It does it in a way that well, it's clever. It's very clever, but I don't think it succeeds. I don't know whether you want me to try to go into that or not. I'm not sure, that I probably have to refresh my memory to be sure that I'm being fair to Mark and saying why I disagree with him. But anyway.
No, that's perfectly good. I mean, we can leave that one where it is and move on to the second one, if that's all right. Sure. You also discussed Neo-Aristotelian naturalism, and the basic idea from that, as I take it, is that the good has to do with, well, what's good for humans given their nature somehow. So I don't know, man, that's not a very good introduction to it, but I guess maybe if you could describe this sort of view.
Yeah. Well, it's a cool view. It picks up on the Aristotelian idea that things have a nature in virtue of which there are certain excellences that attach to them. And so the contemporary version of this would say that in the case of all kinds of natural things, biological things that we're familiar with in the natural world, they have goods and bads in virtue of their nature. So it's good for a tree that it has water and sunshine. It's good for a cheetah that it has room to run, right, and it has prey to attack, and so on and so forth. I suppose it's bad for the prey to be captured, but it's good for the cheetah to capture it, and I don't know, something like that. So the idea is that this extends to the human case, that there are aspects of our nature in virtue of which certain things are good for us and certain things are bad for us. Certain things make for a good life for us and certain things make for a bad life for us, just in virtue of our biological nature. That would be the primitivist, the sort of initial intuition, but this kind of view really bifurcates in two. So you have people like Philippa Foot, who think that the real grounding of this is not in biology, but is rather in life forms. And then you have people like Paul Bloomfield, for whom the grounding of this does rest in biology. So, Foot would say that the important point is that the human way of life is such that having friends is good for us, having loved ones is good for us, living in a community is good for us, having a meaningful work is good for us, and so on. And this is not a matter of biology. We are evolved creatures, and other evolved creatures also have goods and bads in virtue of their ways of life. In our case, it's in virtue of our way of life that we have, that certain things are good for us and certain other things are not good for us. Bloomfield would say that the things that are good for us are things that enhance our fitness, and that a flourishing life is a life that exemplifies the characteristics of human beings that enable us that enhance our fitness in characteristic normal environments. So a good a human being needs eyes to see, so that's part of what it is to have a good life. But we also need certain virtues, certain psychological virtues, in order to lead a good life, and these virtues can be explained in terms of what characteristic traits would have been fitness enhancing. So courage would have been fitness enhancing, because it enables us to face the dangers that our ancestors needed to face, our distant ancestors needed to face in order to be fit in their natural environment. Temperance, I guess, would have been a virtue also in our natural environment, in that in the natural environment we wouldn't want to overindulge in some things or underindulge in other things, and so on and so forth. So one of the accounts rests on the notion of life form, and the other account rests on biological notions. But both of them aim to explain normativity in terms of what's good for us in relation to sort of our natural mode of living, put it that way.
Right. Yeah, that's good. I mean, I could see a bunch of issues that views like this can face. I mean, one might be that, look, there might be things which would contribute to our natural way of living or our fitness as a species, which we would normally consider quite immoral. I mean, maybe if it turned out that something like some sort of like eugenics was promoted the fitness of the species or something like that, well, okay, but we wouldn't say that it's good, because of all the suffering and otherwise that would cause, even if it, on the whole, benefits the fitness of the species. So, I mean, yeah. So, and also, I mean, I was wondering as well, there's a worry that if we talk about what's good for, whichever sense we're talking, for humans might not be sensitive to differences between individuals, especially given different interests, different situations, and so on. That might not be picked up on by more general facts about human nature and what's good for humans. So yeah, I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about some of these worries. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, one example I give in the book is so a case of a woman who's lost in the desert, right? And we can imagine that she's got all the virtues that on either the Foot approach or the Bloomfield approach would sort of constitute her as a person living a good life, and that she's got courage, she's got temperance, so on and so forth, she's got various skills and so on and so forth, but she's not living a happy life, she's not flourishing. What she really needs is to be able to find water, and to find water, maybe what she really needs is to be able to track animals, back to where they're finding water. This is not an ability that would have been fitness enhancing in the circumstances in which we evolved. But she's not living in normal circumstances such as the human species evolved in, but she's living in a rather extreme circumstance. So what's good for her, what will allow her to live a flourishing life, might be quite different from what would be good for a person living in contemporary New York City would need in order to live a flourishing life. So I think that there can be circumstances in which, as you say, that people live in different circumstances, and because of the differences in their circumstances, what might have been made for a good, flourishing life in the circumstances in which the species evolved or in which the species lives its normal life form would not be good, or in the special circumstances of some individuals. So I think this account, you might say, overgeneralizes. That's one worry. Another worry is that it's just not clear to me why a person, I guess this is related to the first point, but it's not clear to me why a person would have any real reason to want to live a flourishing life in general, just on the this fact about the evolution of the species, or about the normal life form of the species, would give us a reason to want to be that way. It's just not clear why that would be the case. If we were Martian zookeepers, who were putting together a zoo containing the best examples of cougars and anteaters and human beings, we might, under those circumstances, pick a cougar that best exemplifies the virtues of cougars living in the environment in which cougars evolved, the best examples of anteaters, exhibiting the features that are characteristic of anteaters in virtue of the way that they evolved, or in virtue of their life form, and similarly for human beings. But this theory purports to be giving us an account of characteristics that we would have reason to choose, or that we would be well advised to choose, and it's not clear why we should want to be such that a Martian zookeeper would want to have us in their collection. So I don't see this. In the end, I don't see this as an adequate account of normativity, but it certainly is in the ballpark, because it gives us an account that's grounded in natural features of human beings, that can explain reasons and goodness for human beings in naturalistic terms, and that has a certain intuitive plausibility to it. So I think it's a starter. Whether it can answer all the objections is another question, but I think it's it's definitely a naturalistic theory of normativity, which deserves to be taken seriously.
Fair. Yeah, I can see that. But there's some problems there as well. Okay, so finally, you have your a view that you put forth. You call pluralist teleology, and as I understand the rough idea, look, there's these different kind of problems that we face that relate to normative governance. So, in the practical reason domain, and the moral domain, and the epistemic domain, and these domains end up arising to solve different problems. I don't know. Maybe you can put it better than me, but how does this view work? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the basic idea is that there's that as you put it, there are certain problems that human beings face because we're social animals, because we have our own perspective on our lives as well as being social animals, and because we need information in order to live our lives. We face certain problems. One problem is how to get along with each other, cooperatively, so as not to tread on each other's feet, but to be able to live lives cooperatively as we need to, given the kinds of beings we are. We're not self-sufficient. We don't come into the world fully equipped. We rather need to be raised in a family. The family needs to be embedded in a larger society, because families themselves, there's a division of labor. Some families are better at some things, some families are better at other things. So we need this kind of cooperative social environment in which to live, because we're social beings, to put it in a nutshell. And so morality is, I think, geared to solving this problem, the problem of enabling us to live together successfully in groups. But we also, a second problem we face is that we're individuals with our own perspective on our lives. We have certain values, we have certain needs, and we need to, the problem is that we won't be successful in pursuing these values and achieving what we need if we aren't let's say single-minded, if we can't sort of ignore temptations and put them aside while we pursue what we truly value and what we truly need. So there's this problem of, I call it the problem of autonomy, the problem of how to govern our lives successfully given temptations and distractions that often take us away from what we truly value. And then the third problem is that we need information, both to live our lives successfully pursuing what we value and need, and also to live our lives successfully in groups. We need accurate information about what the world is like. But we're not naturally really great at distinguishing the truth from the true from the false. There's certain norms that we learn as we grow up about having to do with critical thinking, having to do with evaluating evidence, and so the norms that ground epistemic rationality, I think, are those that are well designed to solve this problem of sorting the true from the false. So there are at least these three problems of normative governance, and I think the moral, the prudential, and the epistemic are three realms of normativity, which are each geared to solving the respective problems. That's the basic idea. So in a nutshell, you might say normative facts are related to solutions to problems are grounded in solutions to problems of normative governance.
Good. Yeah, I find this food really interesting. I mean, do you think there's any worry that, well, in that these things arise out of our need to solve certain problems, that it makes it sort of desire dependent in a way that some of the issues that came up with the neo-Humean subjectivist view, is that where you kind of arise here as well, or do you think it's adequately categorical or stance independent?
Right. Well, right. So I describe these as problems, and I think they are well described as problems. And because they're problems, we care about them. But and you wouldn't want an account of normativity to sort of be invoking facts that we have no reason to care about. So I think that's actually a feature, not a glitch. But the basic facts that I think that there are not desire dependent. So I think it will be that there will be the case that there's certain ways of organizing society that are better designed to solve the problem of sociality, as I call it, the problem of how to live together successfully in groups, cooperatively, and so on. There will be certain ways of organizing society that work better than other ways, and certain sets of moral norms that work better than other sets of moral norms, and enabling us to work together successfully. And I think this is a call it an engineering fact. It's a fact that has to do with how we are, with our basic nature as human beings and the basic circumstances that we're in. And so it's I think it's appropriately not desire dependent. Similarly for the other cases, but it is true that we care about these things, and that's why they're salient. But see, fundamentally, the view is that of all the facts that there are out there in Plato's realm of facts or types of properties and so on and so forth, there are some that we have paid attention to in our cognitive lives. Amongst them are facts about properties having to do with nourishing food and so on and so forth, and others are facts having to do with how to get along together in groups. Those are the moral facts. Others are facts about how to organize your life so as to be resistant to temptation and distraction. Those are the prudential facts, and others are facts about how to assess evidence and decide what to believe. Those are the epistemically normative facts, right? So these are facts that I think obtain, and the reason that we have to be interested in them is that they have to do with problem solving, and the reason we have reason to care about problem solving. Reasons of different kinds, moral reasons and prudential reasons and epistemic reasons, right? So the theory sort of explains why we have reasons to pay attention to the facts that it says are reasons, which is what you want. But they're not really desire-dependent reasons.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean, maybe the worry would be something like, okay, sure, there are facts about how to effectively get along in groups. However, why do we have a reason to, engage in those practices? Why is it good to effectively get along in groups or whatever? And the thought might be, well, doesn't it just come back down to, well, these are problems that we're trying to solve, and so maybe we have a reason to do this because that's a problem we're trying to solve, because we want to be able to get along in groups and so on. So maybe it does come back to the desire. I don't know. Maybe that's the way to put the worry that I'm getting at. But do you see what I'm saying? Maybe.
Yeah, I do. I see what you're getting at, but the answer is really just digging in my heels at this point, saying yeah, we do have desires, so we have perhaps we have reasons of the sort that Mark Schroeder was pointing to, reasons grounded in desire, to pay attention to these facts. But these facts are independently normative. So we have a reason to cooperate, regardless of what we want to do. Now, we probably want to cooperate, unless we're pretty weird people. Some people maybe don't want to cooperate. But those of us who want to cooperate have desire-based reasons to pay attention to these other reasons. But there are these other reasons quite independently of whether we want to cooperate. It's that cooperating will enable us to get along together and to solve this problem of that I call the problem of sociality, the problem that we need to be able to get along together in groups and to deal with fact that people have conflicting desires and conflicting needs, and there's a shortage of things that they want, and so on, and that can lead to conflict unless we accept norms that that govern resolution of conflicts and so on.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, this could be explored further, but at this point, maybe it'd be useful to, I guess we can look at chapter 9, maybe a couple of the objections you consider, and then we can wrap up with chapter 10. Yeah, I guess you've covered a couple of the problems already. Like you talked a bit about the just too different worry. Yeah, did we talk about the is-ought gap?
I talked about that right at the beginning of our discussion, but we can go over it again if you want to. The basic worry is there that I think it's related to the just too different objection, in that the objection is that, well, there are facts about the way the world is. These are the natural facts. Then there are facts about what we ought to do, how we ought to live, values, so that we have this fact value gap, we have this is-ought gap. These are very different types of facts. And you can infer one from the other. No matter how much you know about the way the world is, you're not going to validly conclude anything about how we ought to behave. No matter what the facts are as to how the world actually works, that's not going to logically support any claim about how we ought to live or about what values we ought to have. So there's a fundamental gap there that naturalism pretends to bridge, but it can't be bridged, and so naturalism has to be mistaken. Something like that, I think, is the is-ought objection. And what I want to say in response to that is that there are various logical quibbles to this way of putting the objection, but I think what it boils down to, if we set aside the quibbles, what this objection or this worry boils down to is the just too different objection, the idea that the moral and normative facts and properties are just too different from natural ones for the one to be identified with the other. There are cases where we have no trouble saying that some kind of fact or some kind of property is a natural one, even though it can't be deduced from others. So, for example, this is an example that Nick Sturgeon used to offer, that from facts and physics, we can't validly conclude anything in biology, but we have no trouble thinking that biological facts are natural ones, just as physical ones are natural ones. So the existence of a valid inferential chain from one kind of fact to another kind of fact, where the first kind of fact is indisputably natural, isn't a necessary condition of identifying the other set kind of fact as natural. We can identify the biological facts as natural ones, even though nothing about the biological can be validly deduced from physical facts by themselves. Similarly, we can I think claim that the normative facts are natural, even though we can't validly conclude anything. We can't validly conclude anything about the normative facts from purely non-normative facts. So the response to the is-ought objection is really the same as the response to the just too different objection, and it's also to point out the analogy of the between the is-ought gap and the physics biology gap.
Right. Yeah, and if you phrase the problem as something to do with derivability, it's like, okay, it might be that if you put from certain sets of sentences, you may be only able to validly derive certain other sentences, maybe the ones that don't involve normative terms. But so what? I mean, that doesn't show the non-identity of the ethical properties with natural ones, as you're just showing something about a formal logic, maybe.
But I mean, this objection was sort of more widely accepted as important back in the day, when people thought that any kind of naturalism would have to offer a conceptual analysis of the normative in terms of the non-normative or in terms of the indisputably natural. But nowadays people aren't really intending to offer conceptual analyses of the normative. So, for example, my pluralist teleology isn't meant to offer a conceptual analysis of the moral facts, and I think neo-Humean subjectivism isn't meant to offer a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a reason. It's a theory about the nature of reasons. In my case, it's a theory about the nature of normativity, but not meant to be grounded in our concepts. So you wouldn't expect there to be these conceptually valid inferences from the one to the other.
Right. Yeah, actually, this does remind me. I previously talked with Professor Akhil Bilgrami, and he has an interesting, although somewhat complicated argument against moral naturalism. And I wanted to sort of give it briefly and see, as brief as I can anyway, and see what you think about it. So basically, he's calls it a kind of pincer argument. So, okay, for the naturalist who claims that ethical normative properties are natural properties, are identical to them, there's basically two options that he thinks you can have broadly. It either could be an analytic identity, you could derive it from the meanings of the terms that they
Right.
denote the same thing, or something like that. We don't need to get into what it is to be analytic exactly. And then the second option is that it's synthetic. But if it's synthetic, then we have two different senses in this kind of sense reference sense. So we have senses using normative terms that refer to normative properties that are co-referential with senses using natural terms and natural concepts that refer to natural properties. And so that's how they co-refer. However, if this is the approach that is taken, then there's a sort of further dilemma which faces the naturalist. Either the sense that is used to refer to the normative properties, like sort of inelimitably uses non-natural terms, non-natural concepts, or it does not inelimitably use them. If it does inelimitably use them, then it just has to refer to non-natural properties. But if it's not inelimitable, then it seems to fall back to a sort of analytic naturalism, because they could be replaced with natural terms. I don't know if I've explained this very well, but the worry kind of appeals to the notion of this like a Fregean sense, and like, well, if it's using these, if the sense has to use these quote unquote normative or non-natural terms, then, well, it's going to end up having to refer to something non-natural. But if it doesn't have to use them, it could use non-natural ones instead, then they seem to fall back to a sort of analytic naturalism or something like that.
So what do I
that was really clear.
What do I make of that?
I might not have done it good justice because it's sort of complicated and it's kind of long, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I see the basic. I think I see the basic strategy.
Yeah.
One response to it would be to look into this notion of a sense and a reference and so on and so forth, and to take issue with the Fregean picture if that's what the argument depends on. Another approach would be to just consider examples where it seems like we do have identities, and to consider whether the argument would show that these identities couldn't possibly be correct, in which case the argument's proving too much, or it's really not successfully proving anything because it's proving something to be false that we know to be true. So take the claim that to be an acid is to be a proton donor, right? Now here we have, and let's assume this is not meant as a conceptual analysis. I don't think it is meant as a conceptual analysis. So let's take that horn of the dilemma. And I think in the case of the three theories that we talked about a little bit ago, the neo-Humean subjectivism, neo-Aristotelian naturalism, and pluralist teleology, those theories aren't meant as conceptual analyses either. So let's take the horn of the dilemma that takes the identities to be synthetic. Okay. So how's the argument supposed to deal with the acid the example of the reduction of acids to proton donors? I mean, you've got a term on the left, acid, with a sense that Well, it refers to acids, and you've got a term on the right with a sense that, in virtue of which, the one component term, it's a complex term, right? To be a proton donor, so you've got to be a donor, which refers to some relation of donating, right? And you've got proton, which refers to protons, right? So how can we? So we acknowledge that, but then on what basis do we conclude that it couldn't possibly be that to be an acid is to be a proton donor, just on the basis of the fact that the facts about the senses of these terms? Or another example would be the reduction of life. So I think that to be a living thing is to be a thing with a certain complex biochemical property. Now, I can't say what that complex biochemical property is. But I assume there is such a property, because I think that for something to be alive is not for it to have some mysterious like quality of the sort that vitalists think that living things have. I think to be alive is to be, it's a complicated thing, but it's basically a biological thing to be alive. And so we have so I don't know, let's say to be alive is to be XYZ or XYZ if you prefer, being north of the border, right? So to be alive is to have this complex property, which we can't really state because we're not biochemists, and maybe it'd be maybe it's so complicated that we don't yet know really how to cash it out, but we believe it's a biochemical property. So there'll be some on the left-hand side. We have the predicate being alive, which invokes the concept of being alive, which there's a certain sense there, which refers to the property of being alive. And on the right-hand side, we have some complicated thing being XYZ, which refers to some complex of stuff, the being X, the being Y, the being Z, and some relation amongst those things. Each of those terms has its own sense, and the relation amongst them is designated by some term which has its own sense. I don't see how we can conclude from the basis of these terms having their own senses that are, where there isn't a conceptual analysis of the left in terms of the right stuff on the right, but rather claim that it's a synthetic matter that the two things are identical. I don't see how you can conclude on that basis that couldn't possibly be true, that to be alive is to have this complex property of being XYZ. So I just don't see this argument as getting us off the ground. I don't see how it's supposed to work. Now there's maybe a presupposition of the argument. I'm guessing, because I don't know, I don't know the argument firsthand. I know what you said about it, but I don't know the argument firsthand, so I'm guessing. But I think, given that you said it's based in Fregean, a Fregean picture, I'm guessing that the picture was that the picture that Fregeans have is that the sense of a term determines its reference, right? So perhaps the idea behind the argument was that the sense of the normative terms determines what they refer to, and it might have been presupposed that the sense of a normative term would have to refer to something that was normative. And now, since we're proposing that the reduction we're thinking of is synthetic and not analytic, that non-normative thing would be irreducible. But none of that really follows, I think, because the fact that we have a concept that's irreducible doesn't show that we have a property that's irreducible, right? It may be that the concept of being a living thing is not one that we can give a conceptual analysis of that reduces it to some biochemical set of biochemical concepts that are related in appropriate ways. Because it may be that the concept of being a living thing is unanalyzable. I mean, we can't really say what it is to be alive, but we have this theory that identifies being alive with having this complex biochemical property, right? So the fact that the concept is at least arguably unanalyzable doesn't show that the referent of it has to be some unanalyzable property, right? So, I mean, Belgrami is an excellent philosopher, so no doubt there's stuff there that I'm not grasping and not, giving adequate attention. But my take is that there's going to be a problem with it, and it's along the lines I've been trying to gesture in the direction of.
Yeah, that's all really good stuff. It's funny because you gave the example of the acid and proton donor, and when I first came across this, I was thinking, like, well, okay, but what about like watery properties and certain chemical properties? Like, couldn't we just reframe the same argument but replace normative with watery and natural with the chemical properties, and derive the conclusion that therefore that watery properties are not identical to any chemical properties? Yeah. It seems to me like the argument is just as good, and yet the conclusion is too strong.
Yeah, that's along the lines of what I was thinking too. Yeah.
So where exactly it goes wrong?
Did you raise that objection, and did he respond to it or not?
I don't remember exactly. I remember asking him a couple of questions, but I don't think we got into this argument specifically. I have to recall. Yeah. We talked a bit about natural properties and stuff. His view about natural properties was that a property is natural if it's something like it's in principle investigatable by like the sciences or something like that, which is sort of like an epistemic condition. It's kind of similar. Yeah.
But the sciences, after all, are identified by their methodologies, and they're just our best way of exploring the empirical world. So yeah.
Right. But anyway. That seemed to be the major issue that I had with this, is that it's just like, there's also this ambiguity when it comes to, well, does the sense, when we say that the sense expresses a natural property versus a non-natural one, what exactly does that mean? Or is that something just about what sort of concept it is, or what sort of term it is? Like, there's the sort of quote unquote stereotypical natural ones and stereotypical non-natural ones. Because if we want to count, say, the normative as a quote-unquote non-natural term, well, it seems to be an open question whether, no pun intended, that happens to refer to something in the natural world. Anyway, but yeah, there's some interesting stuff to explore there.
Right.
Okay, we've been going for a while, so I'll probably wrap up in a couple minutes if that's good with you. Okay. But it's probably worth. We don't need to cover any more of the objections that you consider in the book. Again, I'll include.
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe we should talk about the just too different objection, because I think really underlies everything. I think it underlies all the objections to naturalism.
Yeah, I mean that's
I think basically my take on it is that basically people have the just too different intuition. The natural and the normative are just too different. They couldn't possibly be the same thing, and then they try to gin up an argument that's as opposed to just citing this intuition, they try to gin up an argument that captures something behind, that can be more, that's more precise and more, has a sharper edge than just an intuition. But I think what underlies all the objections is this intuition that the natural and the normative are just too different. And and I think that this objection, the just too different objection, is basically what's going to make people resist any of the three positions that I think are still on the table. It's just too different; couldn't possibly be the same. So how would I respond to the just too different intuition? Well, in a nutshell, I guess, let's see. Maybe there's two things to say. One is to rely on an analogy, right? The analogy of vitalism. You might think, that the property of being alive is just too different from any biochemical property for it to be possibly the case that being alive is to have some complicated biochemical property. How could it be that to be alive is to have some complicated biochemical property? This, I think, is what motivated vitalism. Vitalism was the idea that there's some couldn't be that just the flowing of liquids and the chemical reactions taking place in a body and so on, that's what it is to be alive. There has to be some special property. I mean, in Christianity and other theologies, there'd be the idea of a soul infusing the body, the matter of the body, and making it alive. But I would think that, of course, some people will think that, to be alive is just too different from any biochemical property for them to be one and the same. But I would think that it's not, a credible objection to a biochemical theory of life to say something like that. So that's the first response. That's sort of a response by analogy. You wouldn't want to object to the biochemical theory of life on a similar basis. And then the other half of it is just to say that, look, an intuition is only an intuition. An intuition is only a tendency that we have to believe something without further thought. And we have lots of intuitions, and we can't always trust our intuitions. I think I myself have the intuition that life couldn't possibly be just a complicated biochemical reaction, and that normativity couldn't possibly be just one of these naturalistic properties. I mean, it seems it's hard to credit these theories. It's intuitively we're inclined to believe that we're inclined to resist these theories, I think, but I don't think that that intuitive resistance is probative. I don't think it's a good reason to give up on these theories, any more than a detective's hunch that Jones is the killer, should be probative. The detective might agree that he has this hunch, but think that he needs evidence, and come to think that the hunch was false, right? So I think that once we understand the nature of an intuition, we should understand that an intuition isn't really a good basis for theorizing. And once we think of some examples where we also share an intuition that an analysis couldn't possibly be true, but where the analysis plausibly is true, that we should give up on this just too different intuition and not take it to be an insuperable barrier to naturalism.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good approach. I mean, you could, so long as the just too different intuition doesn't involve, it doesn't show that like there's an in principle distinction there. Like it's just not possible that they're the same thing. Like a some sort of a priori conceptual truth or something like that. Then okay, even if we grant that the intuition maybe gives us some reason to doubt the identity, maybe on the whole we have enough reason to affirm it or to doubt that intuition.
Right.
Then maybe that's where you want to go. I mean, it's not like
the intuition is nothing, right? The intuition is something, and we need to like try to make ourselves comfortable with a theory that rejects the intuition, right?
Right. It's not nothing, but it's also not necessarily decisive.
Decisive, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So there's still room to grant that we have those intuitions. It's funny because people might say similar things about the mental as well. Like the mental is just too different from the natural or the physical. And
exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a case where, that's a case where I think the similar intuition really, has gotten a lot of mileage, but at the same time has been resisted by people that are, want to give physicalist accounts of the mind. And, so we're in a similar position here in defending ethical naturalism. Yeah, good.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So if that's good, I mean, maybe we can give some concluding remarks here. Maybe where do you think this leaves us here at the end of the book?
Well, it leaves us, officially it leaves us with three theories that are still on the table, right? That I don't think any of the standard arguments against naturalism refute the theories. There'll be resistance to the theories, by people who have a strong intuition that no naturalistic theory could be correct. But I think each of these theories offers an analysis of what normativity consists in. Neither I guess none is right. None of them, none of the three is obviously correct. Each of the three has its difficulties. It needs to be developed in more detail. But where we end up with is three naturalistic theories that I think are plausible theories, or at least plausibly are theories of robust normativity that stand on their feet despite the objections. So what I hope to do, if I've got enough time remaining, I mean, not now, but in the future, is to write a book that develops my own theory, this pluralist teleological theory, in more detail. So in a way, it'll be a companion to this book. So this book in a way tries to make the world safe for naturalism by explaining what naturalism consists in, what the natural consists in, what the problems with the alternatives, looks at various possible theories, leaves pluralist teleology as one of the theories on the table, and then after answering objections, sort of walks away. And the new book would then try to take pluralist teleology and develop it in detail, so as to deal with some of the worries that crop up in the last bit of this book, and develop a theory show how this pluralist teleology gives an account of morality, of prudence, and of epistemic rationality, and I hope also a theory of the normativity of law. And so that's what I want to do next, and that's where we are. So if I have time, I'll do it. If not, I'll enjoy my retirement and do some skiing and hiking, and leave it for somebody else to worry about these details.
That's very good. No, I actually was thinking that seems like a sort of natural follow-up from where this book leaves off, to really develop. Because it seems like, although you haven't really fully fleshed it out, but as given, it's kind of fascinating, and I think kind of promising as well as a kind of general approach.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. It's been fun talking about it.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's fun for me because it's my own theory, and I get to talk about it with a smart guy who has good questions. But I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Actually, I do normally end with one kind of general metaphilosophical question. So I don't know if you want to take that.
Okay.
What do you think is the kind of value of philosophy? Like, why is philosophy worth doing? What is it's a normative question.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that there are challenging questions that we all face. Ranging from, I mean, they all sort of center around, what is the meaning of life, or what is the purpose of life, or what are we doing here? Things like that. What is the fundamental nature of reality? Why should we live one way or another? Is the whole of reality what we see around us, or is there something beyond that, more basic, more is there a God? Those are fundamental questions that I think human beings have always faced, and that philosophy has always tried to address in one way or another. So contemporary philosophy tends to be technical and compartmentalized, and tends to focus on often on small issues. But I think insofar as what we're doing is valuable, it's because it shows us a way to try and think systematically and clearly about these deep questions in a way that's hopefully not merely fuzzy, and not merely like throwing word salad around, but it's trying to get to the bottom of things insofar as we can. I mean, there are limits to our ability to answer these questions, obviously, but I think they're always going to be important questions. So that's what I think is the value of philosophy, is that it gives us a way to, the group of philosophers in the world are engaged in a kind of cooperative conversation about all these problems, and trying to come to terms with them. And I think it's a valuable aspect of our culture that we have this, and hopefully we'll continue to be able to have these kinds of conversations. But even if the discipline disappears, there'll still be human beings. Hopefully, there'll still be human beings thinking about these issues. So philosophy is as a discipline, it's a contingent thing, but it's all contingent. But as a discipline, it's more contingent than it is as a matter of our human nature that we want to answer these questions. So philosophy is really built into our nature as human beings, as curious people, who want to understand what we're all about here on Earth.
Good. Yeah, definitely share that perspective. Yeah, that's really good stuff. So, yeah, I guess we'll draw the questions to a close here. Thanks so much for coming on for Copp and writing the book, and let me have a chance to look at it and having this very detailed and interesting.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Take care.